What the Swamp Keeps. Good evening, everyone. My name is Marcus. I'm originally from rural Mississippi, though I've spent the better part of my adult life moving from one end of this country to the other, and beyond its borders, because that's what service asks of you. And I served in the United States Army for nearly 3 decades, retiring at a rank I'm proud of, though I won't name it here. What I will say is that by the time my career was over, I had seen enough of the world to know that most of what we're taught to fear is ordinary, and a small fraction of what we're taught to dismiss is not. The story I'm about to tell happened a long time ago. I was young, 22, maybe 23 at most, a private first class with more confidence than experience, which is exactly the kind of soldier that gets into trouble. This was the mid-1990s. No smartphones, no social media, barely any internet to speak of. News traveled slow, rumors traveled faster, and in certain parts of the country, particularly the rural South, the deep bayou country of Louisiana, the line between what people believed and what people knew was blurry in ways that I never fully appreciated until after what happened in Terrebonne Parish. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I am not a superstitious man. I was raised Southern Baptist, but I shed most of that by the time I was in my teens. I believe in what I can measure, what I can document, what I can report. That instinct is what made me a good soldier. So understand that when I tell you what I witnessed that night in the swamp, I am not embellishing, I am not dramatizing, I am simply recounting what I saw with my own eyes and letting you make of it whatever you will. We were stationed temporarily at a base near Houma, Louisiana, working in coordination with federal agencies on what was officially described as a counter-narcotics intelligence operation. The Gulf Coast Corridor had become a significant transit route for product moving up from South America through Mexico, across the border and into the interior of the United States. Some of it moved by sea, some of it moved by land, and some of it, the part that gave law enforcement the most trouble, moved through terrain that made organized pursuit nearly impossible. The Atchafalaya Basin and its surrounding wetlands are not places you can simply patrol. There are stretches of that bayou country that remain to this day genuinely inaccessible by road. The only way in or out is by flat-bottom boat, by airboat, or on foot. And if you go on foot, you had better know what you're doing because the ground itself will try to kill you. We were a small reconnaissance team, 7 of us total, including our staff sergeant. Our mission was straightforward on paper. Move through a designated grid of wetland terrain, map any structures or encampments that didn't appear on existing surveys, and report back. No engagement unless fired upon, no contact with civilians unless operationally necessary. Just eyes on the ground, boots in the mud, and a radio back to base. The first 2 days were miserable in the way that only bayou country in August can be. The heat was like a physical weight pressing down on you from above. The humidity made every breath feel like swallowing a wet cloth. The mosquitoes were large enough to cast shadows, and they operated in clouds so dense that if you opened your mouth, you'd swallow a dozen of them. We wore repellent that would strip the finish off a car, and it barely made a dent. The terrain itself was the real adversary. What looked like solid ground would give way beneath your boot, and suddenly you'd be knee-deep in black water that smelled of sulfur and rot. We moved in single file, testing every step, watching for water moccasins that had a habit of coiling beneath surface debris and striking before you saw them. 2 men in my unit had previous deployments in Southeast Asia and said the Louisiana backcountry reminded them of Vietnam. I believed them. By the second afternoon, we had mapped 3 abandoned structures, likely old fishing camps, and documented evidence of recent foot traffic along a narrow ridge that ran parallel to a slow-moving channel. Our staff sergeant estimated the tracks were no more than 48 hours old. We noted it, photographed what we could with our disposable cameras, and continued north. It was toward the end of that second day that we spotted smoke rising through the canopy, not the thin, dissipating kind from a campfire allowed to die out. This was steady, deliberate. Someone was cooking. We approached carefully and found a small settlement that I wouldn't even call a village. It was more of a compound, if you could call it that. 8 or 9 structures built on slightly elevated ground at the edge of a cypress stand, overlooking a still black channel. The buildings were constructed from old lumber, corrugated tin, and whatever materials could be salvaged from the surrounding environment. Some had screened porches, one had a rusted satellite dish bolted to its roof, that I doubted had received a signal in years. The people there, perhaps 15 in total, ranging from elderly to very young, watched us approach without much alarm. A few of the children retreated behind their mothers. The adults simply watched. My staff sergeant was a Louisiana native, born in Shreveport, and he had a way with southern rural communities that the rest of us from other parts of the country lacked. He greeted the oldest man in sight, a weathered figure in his 70s, sitting on a stump and chewing something slowly, with a respectful nod and a calm voice. The old man's name was Cypress, at least that's what everyone called him. He listened to our explanation of our presence with the patience of someone who had heard official explanations before and trusted them very little. When my sergeant asked whether they had seen any strangers moving through the area, people with weapons, people behaving furtively, Cypress smiled in the particular way that old men smile when they are deciding how much to tell you. "Don't need to worry about strangers," he said. "This stretch of water keeps itself clean." My sergeant pressed him. "Sir, we have reason to believe there are individuals moving product through this corridor. It would help us considerably if—" "I told you," Cypress said, not unkindly, "this stretch keeps itself clean. Has for as long as I've been here, as long as my father was here before me." He paused and looked out at the dark water. "She sees to it." "She?" I asked. Cypress turned and looked at me. I remember his eyes being an unusual pale gray, almost colorless, which is not uncommon in certain families from that part of Louisiana. "Miss Eula," he said. He offered nothing more, and something about the way the others had gone slightly still at the name made me hesitant to push immediately, but eventually my curiosity got the better of my manners. "Who is Miss Eula?" I asked. Cypress considered the question for a moment as though it were more complicated than it appeared. "She's been here longer than any of us," he said finally. "Longer than this camp, longer than my family's been on this water. She belongs to this place." He gestured vaguely toward the far edge of the compound, beyond the last building, where the cypress trees pressed close together and the light turned green and dim. "She lives back there, doesn't bother nobody, never has. But she watches, and she doesn't like strangers who come here meaning harm." My sergeant asked if we could meet her. Cypress looked mildly amused. "You can look," he said. "I wouldn't try to talk to her. She hasn't spoken a real conversation in—" He thought about it. 20 years maybe. She said something in 2001 when we had that bad hurricane season. Told us to move the boats up the channel. We did. We didn't flood. Everyone else around here lost everything. He stood up slowly, with the careful deliberateness of a man whose joints had made a truce with pain over many years, and gestured for us to follow. He led us to the far edge of the settlement, past a pen holding several large hogs, past a rusted freezer being used as a planter box, to a structure unlike the others. It was low to the ground, barely 5 feet at its tallest point, and built from old brick, the kind with the faded manufacturer's stamp pressed into each one. Spanish moss hung from the single live oak tree that grew immediately behind it, and the roots of that tree had, over decades, worked their way beneath and around the structure until they seemed almost to embrace it. The door was made from a single plank of very old wood, dark with age, hung on leather hinges. "She knows we're here," Cypress said, and he said it with the flat certainty of someone stating an observable fact. He knocked twice gently and then pushed the door inward. The smell hit us before anything else. Not decay exactly, but something older than decay, dry and ancient like the inside of a sealed archive, like paper that has been slowly desiccating for generations. We crowded into the doorway. The interior was barely larger than a prison cell. There was no furniture, just a low wooden platform along the far wall, padded with layers of what appeared to be Spanish moss and burlap, and on that platform lay a woman. I say woman because there was no other word available, but what I saw did not correspond easily to any living person I had ever encountered. She was slight, almost weightless looking, the way very old birds look when they are found on the ground, their hollow bones giving them the strange property of seeming to weigh nothing. Her skin was the color of very old leather and had the same texture, dry and drawn tight across the bones of her face, her hands, her forearms. The bones of her fingers were visible through the skin like the armature of a paper model, Her hair was white, thin, and lay flat against her skull in sparse strands. Her eyes were closed. Her chest did not move. "She's dead," one of my unit said flatly. Cypress shook his head. "She breathes," he said. "Just not the way you and I breathe. You'd have to sit with her for an hour to see one breath, maybe more." My sergeant crouched and studied the figure carefully, professionally. He held the back of his hand near her mouth and waited, then near her nostrils. He straightened up. "She has a pulse," he said quietly. "Very faint, very slow, but it's there." The rest of us exchanged glances. Someone made a quiet joke to cover his discomfort. I didn't laugh. I was looking at her face, and I had the distinct and irrational sensation that something behind those closed eyelids was aware of every one of us standing in that doorway. Cypress gestured for us to back away, and we did. He pulled the door closed with a careful reverence. "How long has she been like this?" I asked. "Like this?" He thought about it. "As long as anyone can remember. My grandmother knew her when she was already this way. That was a long time ago." He walked back toward the center of camp without further elaboration, and we followed. We set up a temporary observation position roughly a mile from the settlement, in a natural blind formed by the roots of a fallen cypress tree. The first night passed quietly. Insect noise, the occasional splash of something large moving in the water, distant sounds that could have been thunder or something else entirely. The second night was different. I was assigned the watch that started around 2 in the morning. The others were sleeping in rotation. The bayou at that hour has a particular quality. The darkness is not simply the absence of light, but something with texture and weight, something that presses against your eyes. Around 3, I heard the sound of a boat engine cutting out, then voices low and moving. My night vision scope showed me 2 figures working their way along the near bank of the channel. On foot, carrying what appeared to be sealed packages, they were moving with purpose and without lights. I radioed my sergeant and watched. The 2 figures were heading in the direction of the settlement. I moved to a closer position, keeping to the shadows of the tree line, and watched them enter the far end of the compound. What happened next unfolded quickly. One of the men began pulling at the door of one of the residences, shouting for someone to come out. The other stood watch. A light came on inside. A woman's voice, frightened, trying to reason with them. Then the crack of a rifle butt against a door that wouldn't open fast enough. Then the door opening. An old man. I believe it was Cypress, came out onto the small porch with his hands up, speaking calmly. One of the intruders shoved him off the porch steps. I had my rifle up. I was calculating angles, positions, the presence of civilians. I was about to key the radio for backup, and then the door at the far edge of the compound opened. Not the door of any residence, the old brick building, the low one by the live oak. The door opened inward, something came out. She moved the way I had not imagined she could, the way you don't imagine a figure that looked like that could move. Fluid and swift, not shambling, not stumbling, she crossed the compound in what I can only describe as a gliding series of movements, and the speed of it was wrong in a way I still struggle to articulate. It was not the speed of someone running, it was something else. The man who had shoved Cypress saw her first. He took 3 steps backward and raised his weapon, and she was on him before he could fire. What followed I will not describe in complete detail. I will say only that the sounds I heard from 40 yards, kneeling in the dark, were sounds I have never discussed with anyone, and have spent many years attempting to not remember with any clarity. The man's partner ran. He ran into the bayou, and I heard the water take him. It was over in less than a minute. She stood in the center of the compound. Cypress had gotten back to his feet. He said something to her, very softly, that I couldn't make out across the distance. She didn't respond. She stood very still for a moment. Her head turned, and I would swear to you, I would swear on every year of service I completed and every oath I took, that she looked directly at me, not in my general direction, directly at me, through 40 yards of darkness and brush. Then she turned and went back inside. The door closed. My sergeant arrived with the others 2 minutes later. They found the body. They found the evidence of what had been done to it, which the forensics team back at base would later attribute, with some uncertainty, to a large predator. Possibly a feral hog, they theorized, though the attending physician noted the wound patterns were inconsistent with any animal attack in his experience. I said nothing. Not that night, not in the debrief, not in the years since until now. Cyprus walked out and stood beside us while my sergeant documented the scene. He looked at the body without apparent distress. I told you, he said simply to no one in particular. This stretch keeps itself clean. I have been back to Louisiana 3 times since then. I have never returned to Terrebonne Parish and I have no plans to. I don't know if that settlement is still there. I don't know if the people are still there. I have no way of knowing what remains in that brick building by the live oak tree. I think about the fact that Cyprus's grandmother knew her when she was already the way she is now. I try to work out the mathematics of that and find that I cannot. What I can tell you is this: there are places in this country, in this world, that maintain themselves according to rules that predate anything written in any law or any scripture. And there are things in those places that have been there long enough to become something that ordinary language struggles to name. I saw one of those things, it looked at me, and it let me leave. I have never decided whether I'm grateful for that or whether I should be afraid of what it means. That something that old, that patient, that deeply settled into its place chose to let me go. Maybe it simply wasn't hungry. Maybe it knew I was watching and it didn't mind. I don't know. I've had 30 years to think about it and I still don't know. What I do know is that somewhere in the wetlands south of Houma, Louisiana, an old woman who should not be alive is still lying on a bed of Spanish moss, breathing once every several minutes, watching whatever passes through her dark water. And God help whoever comes through there meaning harm. The last stop on Route 9. I never told anyone this story in full. Not my sister, not my therapist, not even Marcus, who was there for part of it and still doesn't know what I know now. Some things feel too specific to say out loud. Too real in the wrong direction, if that makes sense. But I've been carrying this for 3 years and I think I need to put it somewhere outside of me. My name is Devin. I'm 31 years old. For about 4 years, from when I was 24 until I was 28, I drove the Route 9 bus for a regional transit company out of Millfield, a mid-sized city in the rural Midwest that most people have never heard of and have no reason to visit. Route 9 was what the other drivers called the long arm. It stretched from the downtown transit hub out through the commercial strip and then curved north through increasingly sparse neighborhoods until it finally reached Caldwell Hollow, which was a collection of trailer parks, a feed store, and a few subdivisions that had been built in the early 90s and never quite filled in. Round trip, the whole route took about 2 hours and 15 minutes on a good night. I worked the evening shift. My first departure was at 6:15 p.m. and my last was at 11:45 p.m. That last run was the one that mattered. By the time I pulled out of the hub at 11:45, there were usually no more than 4 or 5 passengers, sometimes fewer. The stops near Caldwell Hollow were always empty by that hour. I'd loop around the turnaround point at the north end, a cracked asphalt lot next to an abandoned Dollar General, and then come back south on the return leg with nobody on board. It was the part of the job I genuinely enjoyed. The highway was quiet, the radio played whatever I wanted, and I had 40 minutes of almost total solitude before I'd pulled the bus back into the depot. That changed in November of my 3rd year on the job. It was a Tuesday, which I remember because Tuesday was also the night I called my mother, and I remember thinking, as everything unfolded, that I hadn't called her yet and I was going to be late. Strange the details that anchor themselves to you in moments like that. The weather was what I'd describe as aggressively ordinary. Not storming, not beautiful, just cold and still, with a low cloud ceiling that made the sky look like dirty cotton. I'd completed the outbound leg without incident. 2 passengers, an older woman who got off at the community college stop, and a young man with earbuds who rode all the way to Caldwell Hollow and disappeared into the dark without a word. I turned the bus around in the cracked lot, straightened the wheels, and began the return. I was maybe 8 minutes into the return leg. Somewhere on the long flat stretch of County Road 9 where there are no lights and the tree line comes close to the road on both sides. When I glanced into the overhead mirror, every driver does this constantly, automatically, the way you check your blind spot when changing lanes. It becomes reflex after a few months. You don't even register what you're seeing most of the time. But this time I registered it. There was a man sitting in the very last row of seats, right side window seat. I could see the pale shape of him in the dim interior light. The bus had those low amber ceiling strips that stayed on during the drive, just enough to see outlines and shapes. He was large, or seemed large, in the way that someone in a heavy coat seems large. He was sitting perfectly upright, which struck me almost before anything else did, because people who fall asleep on buses don't sit upright. They slump, they lean, they fold over themselves. This man was sitting the way you sit when you're posing for a photograph. I couldn't see his face. He was wearing a hood, dark-colored, pulled all the way forward, and his head was angled slightly down toward his lap, so the hood created a kind of deep shadow where his face should have been. I told myself I'd simply missed him when I boarded. It happened. Not often, but it happened. Sometimes passengers would be in the restroom at the back when you did your sweep, or half hidden by the high seat backs. I told myself this and kept driving. But I hadn't taken my eyes off the mirror for more than a few seconds at a time, and what I noticed over the next several minutes was that the man did not move, not once, not even the small unconscious movements that a person makes. A shift of weight, a tilt of the head, a hand repositioning in a lap. He was as still as furniture. I turned the radio down. The silence of the bus felt different now, heavier, the way a room feels different when you realize you're not alone in it. "Hey!" I called out. My voice sounded thin. "Sir, hey, you might have missed your stop." Nothing. He didn't react at all. I could see in the mirror that his posture hadn't changed even a degree. I tried again, louder. "Sir, last stop was Caldwell Hollow. I'm heading back to downtown now." Still nothing. I drove another mile, then 2. The trees thinned and the road opened up into the flat agricultural land that sits between the hollow and the first set of suburban neighborhoods. It was darker out here, not lighter. The clouds had thickened and the sight lines stretched long and empty in both directions. I made a decision I normally wouldn't make. I pulled the bus onto the shoulder, cut the main lights, and left the hazards on. I stood up from the driver's seat. Walking the aisle of an empty bus at midnight is a different experience than walking it at noon. It's the same 40 feet of floor, the same rubber matting, the same rows of blue-gray seats. But at midnight, every shadow between the seat backs looks like something crouching. My footsteps sounded too loud. I counted the rows as I passed them. 6, 7, 8. Keeping my eyes on the hooded man in the back row. He still hadn't moved. At maybe 4 seats away, I stopped. There was something wrong with the way he was sitting that I couldn't identify at first. And then I could. And I wished I couldn't. He was sitting upright, but his shoulders were wrong. They were too level, unnaturally so, like a mannequin's. And his hands, which I could now see resting on his thighs, were the wrong color. They were very pale, almost blue in the amber light, and they were too still. The stillness of something that has no pulse behind it. I also noticed, for the first time, a smell, very faint. Cold, damp, like soil after a hard rain, or like the back corner of a basement that doesn't get any ventilation. It didn't belong on the bus. "Sir," I said. My voice had dropped to nearly a whisper without me deciding to do that. "Sir, are you all right?" I took another step forward, and the bus horn sounded. I spun around so fast I hit my hip against the seat back. There was nobody at the front of the bus. I could see all the way to the windshield. The door was still closed. Nothing had entered, but the horn continued blaring. 3 long blasts and then silence, the way you tap it if you were impatient. I stood there for a moment, heart slamming, looking between the front of the bus and the back. Then I turned back to the last row. The seat was empty. I don't mean he had gotten up while I was distracted. I mean he was simply gone. The seat was empty. The window was closed. I could see the latch. There was nowhere a person his size could have gone in the 3 seconds my back was turned. I stood at the back of the bus, gripping the seat back in front of me, and looked at the empty seat for probably 30 seconds without moving. Then I looked underneath the seats on either side. Nothing. I checked the small restroom at the very rear. The door was open and the light was off, but I turned the light on and looked inside. Nothing. Just the sink and the toilet and my own reflection in the small scratched mirror above the faucet, looking at me like I'd done something wrong. I went back to the driver's seat. My hands were shaking. I sat for a moment before I could trust myself to drive. Then I pulled back onto the road and pushed the bus toward the glow of the city on the southern horizon. I was about 6 miles from the depot when I saw the woman at the Orchard Lane stop. She was standing under the shelter, the plexiglass and steel structures that dot the route at the suburban stops. and she was waving. Not the casual hand raise of someone flagging a bus, but an urgent, repeated wave, both arms like someone trying to signal a rescue aircraft. I pulled over. She was probably in her mid-50s, wearing a long coat and carrying a tote bag. She boarded quickly, almost stumbling up the steps, and swiped her pass without looking at the reader. She didn't say anything. She sat in the first row directly behind the barrier, which is the seat closest to me. I waited a beat, then said, "Rough night?" She looked at me. Her face was composed but very pale, and her eyes had the particular quality of someone who has recently been frightened. That overlit, wide-open look where the whites show too much. She said, "Is there anyone else on this bus?" Something about the way she asked it made the hair on my arm stand up. "No," I said, "just you and me." She nodded slowly, looking down at her hands in her lap. She had the tote bag on her knees and she was holding the straps very tightly, knuckles pale against the canvas. I started driving. After a few minutes she said without prompting, "I saw something at that stop before you came." I didn't answer immediately. Then I said, "What did you see?" She was quiet for a long moment. There was a man there, standing behind the shelter, not inside it. Behind it, in the landscaping strip where there are those juniper bushes. He was just standing there. In the dark. She paused. He was looking at me the whole time I was waiting, but he wasn't. He wasn't right. His head was covered. He had some kind of hood or cloth over his head, and he was standing completely still. He didn't move the whole time I was there. My hands tightened on the wheel. "And then," she continued very quietly, "when I saw your headlights coming, I felt relieved. I looked away for just a second to watch you pull up, and when I looked back at the bushes," she stopped. "He was gone," I said. She turned and stared at me. We drove without speaking for a moment. Then I told her what I had seen, all of it. The man in the last row, the stillness, the blue pale hands, the horn, the empty seat. She listened without interrupting, and by the time I finished, her hands had gone from gripping the tote bag to pressing flat against her thighs as though she was trying to feel something solid. She said, "Does this route go past the old Harrick Road intersection, where they put up that cross?" I knew the one she meant. There was a small white cross at the intersection of Route 9 and Harrick Road, the kind people put up at crash sites. I'd assumed it was for a car accident. I told her yes, we'd already passed it. "My neighbor told me about that spot," she said. "She grew up out here. She said years ago. She didn't know exactly when. A man was found dead out here, on Route 9. He'd been walking in the road at night, they think. A bus hit him. The driver didn't see him until it was too late. The man had been..." She stopped, reorganized, continued. "He'd done something terrible earlier that night. To his family. He was walking away from it when it happened." She looked at me directly for the first time since she'd boarded. She said the drivers out on this route sometimes see him sitting in the back. She said he's been riding this road for a long time. Her voice was absolutely steady. She said he never gets off. You just have to wait for him to leave on his own. I pulled into the transit hub at 12:51 a.m. I walked the length of the bus twice before I locked it up for the night. The last seat on the right-hand side was clean and empty and cold. The next morning I went to the depot early and looked up what I could. The company kept an informal record of incidents. Nothing formal, just a binder in the driver's lounge that people added to over the years, mostly mechanical problems and passenger complaints. But in the back of the binder there were some older pages, handwritten, that didn't fit the same format as the rest. I found 3 separate accounts from 3 different drivers written in 3 different handwriting styles, spanning what I estimated from context clues to be about 20 years. Each one described the same thing. A figure in the last row on the return leg of the night route, hooded, motionless, gone before the driver could make contact. The most recent account was dated almost 7 years before I found it. The driver had written a single line at the end of their account that I have not forgotten. "Don't stop the bus on Harrick Stretch no matter what. Just keep driving and he'll go on his own." I thought about the horn, the 3 blasts, mechanical and insistent. I thought about how both times the horn had sounded at crash sites I'd been called to over the years, it was because someone had slumped against the wheel, a pressure, a weight. I still drove Route 9 for another year after that night. I never saw him again. But I want to be careful about what I mean by that. I never saw a figure in the back seat again. What I mean is, there were nights on that return leg when the interior of the bus felt different, heavier, when the amber ceiling lights seemed to dim slightly for no electrical reason I could identify, and when the cold coming off the rear of the vehicle was sharper than it should have been, even in summer. Nights when I found myself checking the overhead mirror more than usual and looking away faster than usual, the way you avoid eye contact with something you've decided not to acknowledge. Whether that counts as seeing him again, I honestly don't know. What I know is this: I quit driving Route 9 at the end of that third year. I still drive. Different company, different city, different routes. I do the daytime shift now. I haven't told my new colleagues why. There are things about certain jobs, certain stretches of road, certain hours of the night that don't translate. You either know or you don't. But every now and then when I'm driving home from a late shift and I pass one of those small white crosses at the side of the road, the kind people put up at crash sites with plastic flowers and sometimes a photograph, I find myself thinking about the man in the last seat, about his level shoulders and his blue pale hands, about the 3 blasts of the horn in the dark. And I think someone put a cross somewhere for him too once, and I think about what it means for a thing like that, a person like that, to still be riding, to never reach the end of the line, the weight of empty miles. Good evening. My name is Marcus, and I want to share something that happened to me. I've been told this channel treats people's experiences with respect, that you don't laugh at what you can't explain. That matters to me more than you know, because what I'm about to describe has cost me sleep, cost me a relationship, and nearly cost me my sanity. My doctor says it's a dissociative episode brought on by extreme stress. He says the marks on my skin were self-inflicted, something I did without realizing it during a breakdown. He's a good man, and I don't blame him for saying that, but I know what I saw, I know what I felt, and I've never stopped knowing. Let me give you some background so you understand the state I was in. Up until about 3 years ago, I had what most people would call a good life. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm a long-haul truck driver out of southern Ohio. Been doing it since I was 24. It's a solitary job, I know that, and it does things to a person's sense of time. Days blur into highway blurs into radio static, and somewhere in the middle of all that you have a home you barely recognize because you're never in it long enough to learn where the light switches are. My wife Claire had been patient with that reality for almost 9 years. She was the kind of woman who made things work quietly, without complaint, without drama. She raised our son Daniel practically on her own during the weeks I was gone, and she never threw that in my face. Not once. She kept the lawn trimmed, attended Daniel's school events alone, drove herself to her own doctor's appointments, and always had a meal ready when I came home, no matter what hour I rolled in. I thought that was love. Looking back now, I understand it was something closer to resignation. I noticed the change in March. I'd come home from a 10-day run through the Northeast and something was different in the house. Not dramatically different. Nothing was thrown, nobody was crying, but different in the way that an old photograph looks different when you haven't seen it in years. The colors have faded somewhere you weren't watching. Claire smiled when I came in, kissed my cheek, asked about the drive, but she went to bed early that night, and the night after, and every night that week. Daniel, who was 13 at the time, stopped coming to the door when he heard the truck pull in. I told myself it was an age thing, that 13-year-old boys don't run to greet their fathers, that was normal. I told myself a lot of things. It was a co-worker of mine, a dispatcher named Phil, who finally said what I hadn't been willing to say to myself. We were sitting in the break room and he asked me out of nowhere how things were at home. I told him fine. He gave me a look I'll never forget. The kind of look a man gives you when he knows you're lying and he's deciding whether to let you keep doing it. "You sure about that?" he said. I wasn't. I hired a private investigator. I'm not proud of it. It felt like a betrayal even as I was doing it, paying someone to follow my wife and compile evidence of a life she was living without me. But I was desperate in that particular way that comes from not knowing. Not knowing being worse in some ways than knowing the worst. It took the investigator 6 days. He called me on a Wednesday afternoon while I was parked at a fuel stop in Pennsylvania, and he walked me through everything in a flat, professional tone that somehow made it worse. Claire had been seeing someone, a man named Derek, who she'd met through a neighborhood social app. The kind people used to trade lawn mowers and discuss local ordinances. They had been meeting 2 to 3 times a week for the better part of 5 months. The investigator said Derek had a reputation in certain circles: charming, well-dressed, and financially predatory. He had a pattern of targeting women in emotionally vulnerable situations, establishing intimacy quickly, and gradually separating them from their savings. He had 2 civil suits in his background and 1 criminal complaint that had been dropped. I sat in that truck for 45 minutes after the call ended without moving. When I got home that night, I didn't scream. I didn't break things. I waited until Daniel was in his room, and then I sat down across from Claire at the kitchen table, and I placed my phone between us with the investigator's report open on the screen. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. When she finally did speak, it wasn't to deny it, it was to explain it. She said she had been lonely. Not temporarily lonely, not occasionally lonely, but chronically and deeply lonely for years, and she had tried to tell me in small ways that I hadn't heard. She said the house felt like a place she maintained for a man who visited occasionally, rather than a home she shared with her husband. She said Derek had listened to her. He'd asked questions and remembered the answers and texted her good morning every single day, and she knew. She said this clearly, looking me in the eye. She knew that was probably the minimum a person could do for someone they claimed to care about. But it had felt enormous to her because it was more than she'd been getting. I asked her if she wanted a divorce. She said yes. What followed was 6 months of lawyers and arrangements, and Daniel caught in the middle of 2 people trying to be civil to each other through the specific grief of a dismantled life. Claire eventually discovered on her own what the investigator had told me about Derek. She found it out the hard way through a drained savings account and a disconnected phone number. She reached out to me twice after that. Both times I didn't respond. I'm not sure if that makes me noble or cruel. Probably neither, probably just human. Daniel, to his credit, came around. Kids are resilient in ways that shame adults. He spent a weekend with me about 4 months after the divorce was finalized, and somewhere in the middle of a baseball game on TV, he leaned over and said, "I don't think it was all your fault, Dad." That was all he said. I had to go to the bathroom so he wouldn't see me cry. I tell you all of this because you need to understand the mental state I was in on the night it happened. I was hollowed out. I had stopped talking to most of my friends because every conversation eventually circled back to my marriage, and I couldn't take the sympathy. I'd lost weight. I was sleeping badly, eating worse, and pouring everything I had left into the road. Driving was the only thing that made sense anymore. When you're behind the wheel, the world collapses to a manageable size. The lane in front of you, the mirrors, the next exit, nothing else can reach you there. Or so I believed. It was a Thursday in October, and I was returning from a delivery in West Virginia. I'd been on the road for 11 hours. That's legal. Just barely. But the kind of legal that relies on you being in peak condition, which I was not. I was running on convenience store coffee and a stubbornness that had started to eat itself. Around midnight, I took an alternate route I knew from years of driving that stretch. A 2-lane county road that cut 20 minutes off the trip through farmland and patches of old-growth timber. Almost nobody used it at night. I'd driven it 100 times. I started feeling the edges of sleep somewhere around mile marker 18. Not the gentle drowsiness you can fight with the radio. The heavy kind, where your eyelids go down and stay down. And the next thing you hear is the rumble strip screaming at you from the shoulder. I caught it in time, pulled hard back into the lane, and told myself I needed to stop. There was a gravel pull-off about a quarter mile up, used during hunting season. I eased the truck in, killed the engine, and sat in the sudden silence, listening to the tick of cooling metal. Outside it was absolutely dark. No streetlights, no other vehicles, no houses visible from where I'd stopped. Just a tree line on both sides and the sky above, thick with stars the way it only gets when you're far enough from everything. I unwrapped a granola bar I had in my jacket pocket and was staring at nothing in particular through the windshield when I noticed a light on the dashboard. Not any of the instrument gauges. Something external, a pale reflection that hadn't been there before. I assumed it was headlights from a vehicle coming up behind me and checked the mirror. The road was empty. The light intensified. It wasn't white exactly, more silver, with a quality to it I can't quite describe even now. A kind of texture like it had weight. I rolled down my window and leaned out to look up. Above the tree line, descending at an angle that seemed too controlled to be natural, was a light source I cannot explain. It moved the way no aircraft I've ever seen moves. No sound, no blinking navigation lights, no predictable trajectory. It descended slowly until it was perhaps 200 feet above the road, and then it stopped. It simply stopped and hovered, and in its light I could see the gravel of the pull-off and the tree trunks along the edge of the woods with a clarity that seemed wrong for the time of night. I got out of the truck. I don't know why. I've asked myself that question many times, and the only honest answer I have is that my judgment was impaired by fatigue, by grief, by 11 hours of highway. Whatever the reason, I stepped down from the cab and walked about 10 feet from the truck and stood looking up at it. The light moved toward me, not aggressively. Slowly, almost cautiously, like it was measuring something. It came down further and I felt a warmth on my face that shouldn't have been possible from a light source at that distance. Then the warmth intensified suddenly, and what had been gentle became suffocating. I tried to step backward and couldn't. I want to be precise here because I know how this sounds. I was not seized. Nothing was holding me. My feet were on gravel, the truck was 10 feet behind me, but I could not move. It was as though the signal from my brain to my legs was being interrupted somewhere in transit. I stood there trying to lift my right foot and feeling nothing in response. My arms were the same. I could blink, I could breathe, I could feel my heart slamming against my ribs, but I was locked. Then the light came all the way down and everything went white and then nothing. When I became aware again, I was lying on my back. I could tell I was indoors from the quality of the ceiling above me, though the ceiling was dark and I couldn't make out material or height. I was submerged from the neck down in something that was not water. Thicker, transparent, like clearish gel. I could feel it against my skin with a pressure that was uniform and total, like being inside a sealed glove. My face was above the surface and I could breathe, but every attempt to move my arms or legs met with a resistance that didn't feel mechanical. It felt purposeful, like the substance responded to my effort and increased its hold. I screamed, or tried to. What came out was a compressed, strangled sound that I doubt carried more than a few feet. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere to my right that I couldn't see, and then a hand appeared above my face. I want to describe this carefully. It was roughly human in proportion, but the skin was a uniform gray, not pale gray like someone who is ill, but a flat, opaque gray that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. The fingers were longer than they should have been proportionally, and they moved with a kind of fluid deliberateness as they descended toward my face. The fingertips made contact with my cheek and the cold was immediate and profound, like pressing your face against a window in January, except the cold didn't fade the way contact cold does. It deepened. I screamed again. The hand withdrew. What followed next I still don't fully understand. The temperature of the gel began to rise, gradually at first and then with increasing speed until the heat was severe, a burning sensation across every inch of skin that was submerged. I was screaming continuously at this point, not words, just sound. And then, I think in response to the screaming, though I can't be certain, it stopped and then reversed and the temperature fell and fell past comfort and past cold and into a profound freeze that made my teeth knock together and my vision blur at the edges. I lost consciousness again. I woke up on the floor of my bedroom. I know this makes no sense. I was 140 miles from my house. There is no rational mechanism by which I could have ended up there. I lay on the floor for what felt like a long time without moving, orienting myself through familiar details of the water stain on the ceiling by the closet, the smell of the carpet, the street light coming through the curtain. When I finally stood, I realized I was completely undressed. I had been wearing jeans, a flannel shirt, and a jacket when I got out of the truck. None of those things were in the room. On my torso and arms there were marks. Not cuts or bruises exactly, but raised geometric patterns consistent in width, like the impressions left by very fine cord pressed against the skin for an extended period. They covered my arms from wrist to shoulder and my chest in a pattern I still cannot describe coherently. I went into the bathroom and turned on the shower as hot as it would go and stood under it until the water ran cold. Then I put on clothes, went downstairs, and sat at the kitchen table until the sun came up. My truck, I discovered the following morning, was parked halfway up the curb 2 blocks from my house, with the front left corner crumpled against a utility pole. There were grocery bags in the road beside it, from some collision in the night. I have no memory of driving it there. The police came and administered a field sobriety test and a breathalyzer, both negative. An officer told me I was lucky I hadn't hurt anyone and handed me a citation for reckless driving. He told me to get some sleep. The company sent me to a counselor the following week when I came in for a shift and Phil noticed I wasn't right. I sat in the counselor's office for an hour and told her everything, not a summary. Everything, the light, the gel, the hand, the cold. She listened the way therapists are trained to listen, without expression. And when I finished, she asked if I was familiar with sleep paralysis and hypnagogic hallucination, experiences that occur in the threshold between waking and sleep. I told her I was familiar with both concepts and that what I'd experienced was not compatible with either, because it had begun while I was awake behind the wheel of a vehicle in motion, and because of the physical marks on my skin, which she asked to see and which I showed her. She said they could have been caused by the truck's seatbelt during the collision. I couldn't remember. I knew that wasn't true. The patterns were too symmetrical. She prescribed something for anxiety and something else for sleep. I took them. The anxiety medication helped. The sleep medication gave me strange, shallow dreams I didn't like, and I stopped after 2 weeks. The visits began the night after I got home from that counseling session. I was in bed, awake. Not drowsy, not transitional, clearly and completely awake. And when I felt the paralysis return and the same total shutdown, the same complete disconnection between intention and body. I lay on my back and could not speak and could not move and could hear my own breathing in the silence of the room. The bedroom door opened, slowly. It didn't creak because I'd oiled the hinges the previous summer, something I remember thinking at the time was a strange thing to remember. A hand came through the gap first, the same hand. I recognized it immediately. The proportions, the gray, the impossible length of the fingers. Then the door opened further and the being came in. It was roughly my height. The body was thin in a way that suggested the word thin doesn't quite cover. More like compressed. Like it had been assembled to the minimum specification required for function. The head was large and oval, too large for the neck that held it. And the face, if it was a face, was dominated by 2 eyes that took up a third of the frontal surface area. They had no whites. They were dark, with a faint luminescence in the center, like a screen running on low brightness. No mouth that I could see, no nose in any shape I recognized, just those eyes. It stood at the foot of my bed and looked at me. That was all it did. It didn't move toward me, didn't make sound, didn't gesture. It looked at me with those low-lit eyes and I lay there unable to do anything but look back. Tears ran from the corners of my eyes into my hair. Not from pain, from the helplessness of it. From the understanding that whatever was happening was entirely on its terms. After what felt like several minutes, it turned and left. The door closed behind it with a soft click. It came back 7 more times over the following month, always at night. Always the same. Paralysis, the opening door, the grey figure at the foot of the bed, the watching. It never touched me after that first night. It never communicated in any way I could interpret it, simply observed. I developed the impression, irrational as I know that sounds, that it was conducting some kind of evaluation, that I was being assessed. For what purpose and by what criteria, I have no idea. And then it stopped. It stopped the same way it had started. Without announcement, without transition. One night it came, the next it didn't. A week passed, then 2, a month. It didn't return. I've spent a lot of time trying to construct an explanation I can live with. Sleep paralysis accounts for the bedroom visits maybe. The hypnagogic literature does include accounts of paralysis accompanied by a presence, even a figure, even the sensation of being watched. Researchers call it the intruder hallucination. I've read the papers. I understand the mechanism. What I can't explain through that framework is the light on the road, the loss of those miles, the truck 2 blocks from my house with its front end destroyed and the marks on my arms that took 11 days to fade. My counselor doesn't have a satisfying answer for those either, though she tries. I'm driving again. I never really stopped for long. The road is still the place that makes the most sense to me. But I take the interstate now, even when the county road would be faster. I don't pull off in the dark anymore if I can help it. And when I see a light in the sky that I can't immediately identify, I put the truck in drive and I go. I don't know what found me on that road. I don't know what it was looking for or whether it found it. All I know is that there is something out there in the spaces between the lights, in the long dark stretches of empty road, that moves through the night with a purpose of its own. And it is not afraid of us. It has no reason to be. Whatever it was looking for in me. I hope it found it. I hope it has enough. I hope it doesn't come back for more. The Finger Rock. My name is Dale Whitfield and I've spent the better part of my life behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler. I'm from Harlan County, Kentucky. Coal country, where men either go underground or find another way to survive. I found mine on the highway. I've been driving long-haul routes since I was 22 years old, and I'm 56 now. My back hurts every morning when I climb out of bed. My knees aren't what they used to be, and I've got about 2 years left before I can retire with a pension that'll barely cover my property taxes. But I made it this far, and that's more than some can say. I was married for 17 years to a woman named Patricia. We met at a church social in Middlesbrough when I was 24, and she was the best thing that ever happened to me, bar none. She was patient with my absences, with the long weeks I spent away, and she raised our son Marcus with a kind of steady grace that I've never been able to fully explain to anyone who didn't know her. Then when Marcus was 9 years old, Patricia was diagnosed with an aggressive form of ovarian cancer. Within 8 months, she was gone. The doctors said they'd rarely seen it move so fast. I've never fully made peace with that. After Patricia died, it was just the two of us, me and Marcus. He was a quiet boy who kept most things close to his chest the way I always had, but beneath that quiet there was something sharp and curious. Since I had no one reliable to leave him with, I started taking him on runs with me when I could. He'd ride in the passenger seat with his headphones around his neck and a worn copy of whatever he was reading at the time. Some weeks it was history, others it was science fiction, and for a while he went through a phase where he read nothing but true crime, which made me more than a little uneasy. Those years on the road together were the foundation of everything. We'd eat at the same truck stops, argue about the same radio stations, and sometimes drive 3 or 4 hours without saying more than 10 words to each other. But it was never uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of quiet that two people settle into when they trust each other completely. Marcus missed a fair amount of school during those years, but I tried to fill in the gaps. I taught him to read a map before GPS made that obsolete. I taught him basic engine maintenance. I told him about the history of the places we drove through, and when I didn't know, I'd pull up an audiobook and we'd listen together. He repeated a grade twice before his school counselor recognized that he wasn't slow. He was just being educated differently. Eventually, he caught up and surpassed most of his classmates. By the time he was 17, he'd taught himself to code well enough that a regional tech company offered him a part-time remote position. I was prouder of that than I had words for. He turned 20 the previous spring, and he'd grown into a young man who was almost nothing like what I would have expected when he was 9 years old and crying quietly in the passenger seat of my Kenworth while I tried not to cry too. He was tall, lean, and carried himself with a kind of unhurried confidence that seemed to make people trust him immediately. He'd gotten Patricia's eyes, dark brown, watchful, and her habit of listening far more than he spoke. He had no shortage of attention from young women, but he kept most of them at a polite distance, focused on his work and his studies. I thought that was wise. I told him as much. In late September, he called and asked if he could ride with me on a run down through the eastern Tennessee corridor. I was heading toward a logistics warehouse outside of Greenville, a route I'd done 100 times. I told him, of course, and he met me at the yard at 4:30 in the morning with a duffel bag, a thermos of coffee, and what I later recognized as a particular kind of nervous energy he was trying to keep buttoned down. We were about 2 hours out, moving through a stretch of rural highway in Greene County, when he told me about the girl. Her name was Cassidy, he said. He'd met her through an online developer forum, a private community for people interested in low-level systems programming. They'd been exchanging messages for 3 months. She was originally from somewhere in eastern Tennessee, he said, and she was visiting family for a few weeks. He'd been talking about coming to see her for most of that time, and she had told him her family's property was actually not far from the route I regularly ran. "You used me as your chauffeur," I said. He laughed and had the decency to look embarrassed. "I was going to tell you earlier," he said. "I just wasn't sure how to bring it up." I reached over and knocked my knuckles gently against his shoulder the way I used to do when he was small. "Tell me about her," I said. "She was 23, he said. She worked remotely in cybersecurity. She was smart, he said, and careful, and she had a way of explaining technical problems that made you feel like the solution had been obvious all along." He said she'd mentioned in passing that her family kept to themselves, that they'd lived in the same rural community for 3 generations, and that cell service was almost non-existent out there. He said she told him not to worry about it. "She gave me landmarks," he said. "There's a rock formation about a mile off the highway. She said it looks like a hand with one finger pointing up. You can't miss it, apparently. There a town out there? A community. Small. She said it doesn't show up on most maps. I didn't say anything for a moment. I watched the highway and felt something shift in my chest. Not a thought exactly, but a temperature. Something cooling down when it should have been warm. I can drive you up, I said. I don't mind. The road's too narrow, he said. She told me, it's a single-lane dirt track, you'd never get the rig turned around. It's fine, Dad. It's about a mile's walk, and then she'll meet me at the gate. I agreed because he was 20 and steady and hadn't given me serious cause for worry in several years. I agreed because I didn't want to be the father who couldn't let go. But when I pulled over at the unmarked junction and watched him climb down from the cab with his duffel over one shoulder, and when I saw the rock formation rising from the tree line maybe a quarter-mile back from the road, it did look like a finger, upright and deliberate, pale grey against the sky. I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, something I associated with Patricia's diagnosis, a sudden awareness of fragility. He turned and gave me a wave. He had a salute we'd developed when he was about 6 years old. A sort of mock formal thing, 2 fingers to the brow, then a quick extension outward. He still did it every time we parted ways, and it still caught me off guard. Text me when you get there, I said. Obviously. He walked down the junction road and I pulled back onto the highway. The delivery in Greenville took longer than it should have. There was a discrepancy in the manifest, something about a partial load that hadn't been logged correctly at the origin point, and I spent an hour and a half in the warehouse office going back and forth with a floor supervisor who kept insisting the problem was on my end. By the time the paperwork was sorted and the truck was unloaded, it was nearly 6 o'clock and the light was going orange through the warehouse windows. I hadn't heard from Marcus. I'd messaged him twice during the unloading. The first message showed delivered but not read. The second showed only one check mark, not delivered. I told myself this was the cell service issue. She'd warned him, he'd warned me. This was expected. I tried the direct call anyway. It rang twice and then dropped to a recorded message that sounded like it was being routed through some kind of rural network relay. Not a voicemail system, just dead air and then a tone. One of the dock workers, an older man named Aubrey who'd worked the Greenville yard for as long as I'd been running the route, must have noticed something in my face. He was the kind of man who noticed things. He came over with 2 cups of vending machine coffee and set one on the step below my cab door without making a production of it. You got a worried look, he said. I told him about Marcus, about Cassidy, about the junction, about the rock. He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone thinking, the quiet of someone deciding. That formation, he said finally, the Finger Rock, up off Route 107. That's right. He nodded slowly. He set his coffee cup on the bumper and put his hands in his jacket pockets. I grew up about 12 miles from there, he said. My grandmother used to tell us to stay away from that road. When I was younger, I thought it was just one of those things older people say. Don't go in the woods, don't talk to strangers, don't look at the Finger Rock Road. Then when I was maybe 19, a friend of mine decided to hike in there. He was curious. He came back 2 days later and he couldn't tell us where he'd been. Just kept saying he'd been at a gathering. He wasn't hurt, but he wasn't right for about 6 months afterward. Something had been done to him or given to him, and he never could describe it clearly. What kind of people live in there? That's the thing, he said. It changes. My grandmother said it used to be a different group, decades back. Then another group came through. Like the land draws a certain kind. People who want to live outside of everything, outside of records, outside of scrutiny. Some of them are harmless, but some of them practice things I don't have a name for, and they don't take well to outsiders leaving once they've been brought in. Brought in, I said. He looked at me directly. Your boy needs to come out of there, he said. I'm not trying to alarm you, but he needs to come out. He reached into the collar of his shirt and pulled out a length of cord with a small wooden cross attached to it. The cross was dark with age and worn smooth at the edges. He pulled it over his head without ceremony. Take this, he said. I know that sounds like nothing, but take it anyway. I started to object. I've had it for 30 years, he said. It's gone in and out of more rough places than I can count. I want it back when you bring your boy out. I took it and put it around my neck. The drive back to the junction took just under 2 hours. It was full dark by the time I reached Route 107, and the junction road was a seam of pale gravel in my headlights. I made the turn. The rig moved slowly. The road was narrower than I'd expected, brush pressing in from both sides, the kind of overgrown track that suggests it's used regularly but not maintained. I watched for the point where it became impassable. I didn't reach that point before I saw the first structure. A small outbuilding, unpainted, with a rusted metal roof. Then another. Then the road widened slightly into what I would have called a square if it had been more deliberate. Dirt packed hard. 3 or 4 vehicles parked at angles. Old trucks and a van with its windows blacked out. I stopped the rig and killed the engine. The silence was immediate and total. No traffic sound from the highway, no insects that I could hear. Then from somewhere beyond the buildings, a low, rhythmic sound. Percussion. Not music exactly, more like a mechanism. I took the iron bar I keep under my seat, a habit I developed years ago on overnight rest stops in certain parts of the country, and I climbed down. The buildings were dark and shuttered. Most of the windows had cloth hung across them from the inside, but in one I saw a faint orange line at the bottom edge, as though a room within were lit by firelight. I moved toward it and pressed my ear to the wall. I could hear breathing, more than one person, very slow. I didn't knock on that door. I followed the percussion sound around the rear of the building cluster, past a pen where a single goat stood motionless watching me, past a row of clay vessels half sunk into the earth, and through a stand of young pines into a clearing that opened without warning. There were perhaps 40 people arranged around a large fire. The fire was built high, and in its center an effigy of some kind was burning. A tall figure of woven branches and bound cloth, its limbs extended. The percussion was coming from 2 people on opposing sides of the clearing, each with a different instrument, their rhythms interlocking with a precision that seemed less like music and more like mathematics. Near the fire, 3 pairs of people were moving. I would not call it dancing in any sense I recognized. It was more like a slow negotiation between 2 bodies, a series of exchanges, each one more deliberate than the last, as though they were executing a procedure. One of those pairs included my son. Marcus was facing a young woman. She was wearing a dress made of layered cloth, pale and dark in alternating bands, and her hair was loose and decorated with something, small objects braided in, stones or shells, I couldn't tell. She was looking at him with an expression of absolute focus, and Marcus was smiling, but it was wrong. It was the smile of someone who had been told to smile and had forgotten what it felt like from the inside. His eyes were fixed on her face with a glassy, unfocused quality. His movements followed hers with a slight delay, as though he were receiving instructions that had to travel farther than usual to reach him. I had seen that look once before, when Marcus was 16 and had his wisdom teeth out, and they gave him something for the pain that made him talk to me for 2 hours in a tone I'd never heard from him, like the weight had been lifted, like everything was suddenly profoundly all right. I had not liked it then, and I did not like it now. The percussion stopped. The 3 pairs came to a standstill. A man emerged from the far side of the clearing. He was wearing a long coat of some heavy dark fabric and a headdress of layered feathers and carved wood that rose a foot above his skull. He was carrying a bound volume, a large book, the cover dark and matte, the pages visible at the edges in yellow-white. He moved toward the first pair. He opened the book and spoke. The language was not one I could place. Not Spanish, not any indigenous language I'd encountered in 30 years of driving through diverse regions of the country. It was something with no relationship to any other sound I'd heard. The first pair listened with their eyes closed, and when he finished the passage, they sank to their knees and pressed their foreheads to the ground. From another part of the clearing, a woman in dark red moved toward a second fire where a black-furred animal was being held by 2 men. She worked quickly. A girl moved in with a clay bowl. The bowl went to the man with the headdress, and he brought it to the first pair, who drank from it. They collapsed sideways onto the ground, and 2 people on the edges of the gathering moved forward and covered them with a cloth. He turned toward Marcus and the girl. I said, "Don't." My voice came out flat and carry, and seemed to land in the clearing like a physical thing. 40 faces turned toward me. The man with the headdress stopped moving. "Marcus," I said, "I'm here. It's time to leave." Marcus looked at me. For a moment his expression cycled through several things. Confusion, embarrassment, something that looked like grief, and then resolved into something I recognized. He knew me. Under whatever he'd been given, he knew me. He released the girl's hands and took one step toward me. The man with the headdress said something, the girl said something. Two men at the edge of the clearing moved not quickly but purposefully in a direction that would intersect with mine. I raised the iron bar. "He came here on his own," I said. "He can leave on his own. Anyone who disagrees with that is going to have a problem with me." There was a pause that lasted long enough that I could hear the fire. Marcus crossed to me. His walk was off, that same delayed quality in his movements. And when he reached me, and I put my arm around his shoulder, he felt strange, too warm, like he was running a fever or had been standing very close to the fire for a long time. I turned us both toward the pines. "Dad," he said, in a voice like someone surfacing from water. "Just keep walking," I said. We moved through the pines. I could hear footsteps behind us. Not running, which was worse. Deliberate, measured, as if whoever was following was simply matching our pace. We came around the outbuilding and I could see the rig. One of the blacked-out van's doors was open now, and a figure was standing beside it. As we moved toward the truck, I heard a voice from behind me. The man with the headdress, close, 20 feet back. He spoke in the language I didn't recognize, and I felt Marcus slow down. "Keep moving," I said quietly. "He's saying something," Marcus said. "I don't know what it is, but I understand it somehow. He's saying I agreed to stay." "You didn't agree to anything," I said. "Let's go." The figure by the van moved toward us. I stepped between them and raised the bar again, and they stopped. I don't know what they saw in my face. I know what I felt. I had lost Patricia to something I couldn't fight. I was not going to lose Marcus to anything, and I did not care what it cost. I opened the passenger door and got Marcus into the cab. I came around the front of the rig. I could see the man with the headdress standing in the edge of my headlights now, his feathered crown lit from below, his face entirely unreadable. And I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The man in the headdress raised one hand and said something to someone I couldn't see. A figure stepped into my headlights directly in front of the rig. He was holding something. In the wash of the high beams, I could make out the shape. A handgun held low, not yet raised. My right hand found the wooden cross around my neck without my thinking about it. I don't know exactly what made me do it. I pulled it out over my shirt and held it up against the windshield with my palm flat against the glass. What happened next I've turned over in my mind more times than I can count. The man with the headdress took one sharp step forward, looked at the cross with an expression I can only describe as startled, and said something in a completely different tone. Clipped, urgent. The man with the gun stepped out of the headlights. I don't know if they were afraid of the object itself or what it meant about me, whether it marked me as something they'd had bad experience with before, whether it was simply a signal I didn't understand. I don't know. I'm not a superstitious man, or I wasn't before that night. I turned the rig around in 3 brutal points in the tight space, clipping a fence post on the last one. And I drove out of that community and back onto Route 107 and put the highway beneath me as fast as I could manage. Marcus slept for almost 3 hours. When he came back to himself, we were on I-81 heading north, the lights of other trucks around us, the world ordinary and navigable. He sat up slowly and looked out the window for a long time before he spoke. "How did you know?" he said. "You stopped answering your phone." He was quiet. "What do you remember?" I asked. He said he remembered arriving at the junction and walking the dirt road, and he remembered meeting a girl at a gate at the edge of the community. Dark-haired, he said, a few years older than him. Not how he'd pictured her based on their conversations. He said she'd offered him water and he'd drunk it, and after that the night had a texture like a dream. Not frightening, just soft and directionless. He remembered music and firelight and following someone through the dark, and then my voice. "After your voice," he said, "it's clear." "That's enough," I said. He didn't speak for a while then. "She wasn't real, was she? Cassidy, whoever I was talking to for 3 months." "I don't know what she was," I said. He looked at the road ahead. "Someone to bring me in?" I didn't answer that. I filed a report with the Greene County Sheriff's Office 2 days later. The deputy who took the statement was courteous and wrote everything down. He said there had been previous reports concerning the area of Route 107, noise complaints, a missing person report from 18 months ago that was eventually withdrawn, when the person in question reappeared with no memory of the intervening period. He said the community appeared to operate on private land, which created jurisdictional complications. He said they would look into it. I haven't heard anything further. I returned Aubrey's Cross the following week. He was working the day shift when I pulled into the Greenville yard, and I climbed down from the cab and held it out to him without any fanfare. He looked at me and then at Marcus, who'd ridden down with me again, and he nodded once. "Good," he said, and put the cross back around his neck. "I don't run Route 107 anymore. I asked to be reassigned and my dispatcher didn't ask why. In this line of work, drivers occasionally have reasons for avoiding certain routes, and most dispatchers have enough experience not to push the question. The finger rock is still there. I know this because Marcus looked it up on satellite imagery a few months later. You can see it in the aerial view. A pale vertical formation at the tree line, casting a thin shadow eastward in the late afternoon image. If you zoom in close enough, you can make out the dirt track leading back into the trees. You can see the rooftops. He showed me on his laptop one evening and then closed the image without being asked. We don't talk about it much. There isn't a great deal to say that would add anything. What I know is this. I have driven 3 million miles over the course of my career, through weather that should have killed me and over roads that should have swallowed the rig whole, and I have never been afraid of the dark the way I was afraid of the dark in that clearing, not of what I saw, of what I almost didn't get to Marcus in time to stop. He graduated in the spring, computer science with a minor in mathematics. I sat in the third row and watched him cross the stage, and I thought about Patricia and about the 9-year-old boy in the passenger seat with his headphones around his neck and his worn paperback, and about the drive home from Greene County with him asleep against the window while I held onto the steering wheel and kept my eyes on the road and let myself shake. I've got about 18 months left before I retire. I still carry the iron bar under my seat. The long pull. Submitted to Dark Roads podcast. Listener account. I've been meaning to write this for a while. My buddy Marcus told me about your show a few months back when we were both stuck at the same way station outside Amarillo, waiting for a clearance that never seemed to come. He said you'd posted a story from a trucker in Mexico that hit close to home, and when I finally listened to it, he was right. This life does something to you. The long miles, the silence, the way the radio fades out in certain stretches and you're left with nothing but the hum of the engine and your own thoughts pressing in. I know what that does to a man. I've seen it do worse things to better men than me. My name isn't important. I drive long haul out of Bakersfield, California. I've been doing this for about 14 years, ever since my life took a turn I didn't ask for, but probably deserved. My routes vary, but I spend most of my time on I-40 and the highways that branch off into the desert southwest, New Mexico, Arizona, parts of West Texas. Big empty country, beautiful in a way that makes you feel small, and then, on certain nights, in a way that makes you feel like you shouldn't be there at all. I want to be honest before I tell this story. I'm not someone who believes easily. I was raised Presbyterian, but I dropped that somewhere around age 17 and never really picked it back up. I believe in what I can see and touch. I believe in manifests and load weights and delivery windows. So when I tell you what happened on that stretch of US 4912 years ago, I want you to understand that I fought hard against what I was seeing. I looked for the logical explanation at every turn. Some of it I found, some of it I didn't. The backstory matters, so bear with me. Before I drove trucks, I was a wildland firefighter for 6 seasons. I loved the work. Not the danger exactly, but the clarity of it. When you're cutting a fire line in 100-degree heat, there's no room for anything except the task in front of you. Your life gets very simple. I was good at it. I left firefighting because of a woman named Diane, and because of what happened between us. I was 26, she was 24, and we both knew it was the kind of thing that burns hot and burns out. When she told me she was pregnant, I did what I thought was the right thing. I moved back to her town in rural New Mexico, a small place called Cielo Seco, about 40 miles south of Gallup. And I tried to make it work. We weren't good for each other. We had different languages, different silences. After 2 years of trying, we stopped. The custody arrangement was informal, the way those things get when nobody has money for lawyers. Diane had our daughter Lily and I had the road. I sent money every month without fail. Diane cashed the checks, then eventually stopped acknowledging them, and eventually stopped acknowledging me. Lily was 3 when I last saw her. By the time this story takes place, she was 9. 9 years old. Almost a decade of her life I'd missed, sending checks into a void and telling myself that made me a decent enough man. The dispatch that set everything in motion came on a Thursday in October. I was assigned a run from Flagstaff up to Durango, Colorado, medical equipment for a hospital expansion. The route my dispatcher gave me went north on 491 through Gallup and up through the Four Corners region. I was staring at the route on my GPS when I realized Cielo Seco was less than 12 miles off my path. I'd go practically within sight of it. I'd never been back since Diane and I split, and I don't know what moved in me when I saw that little dot on the map, but something did. I had a 2-hour cushion built into my schedule if I pushed through the night. I decided I'd use it. I told myself it was just to see if they were okay. That's all, just a visual check. Maybe I wouldn't even stop. I pushed hard and made good time, and by the time I reached the Cielo Seco turnoff, I had nearly 3 hours of buffer. I took the exit. The road into town was unpaved for the last 4 miles, a washboard dirt track that rattled my teeth and made the trailer groan. Cielo Seco sits in a shallow valley between 2 long ridges of red rock, and at night, with the stars out and no artificial light for 30 miles in any direction, it looks like a place that exists outside of regular time. There were maybe 200 people living there, I guessed. A gas station, a trading post, a small church, a scatter of houses in various states of repair. The kind of town that held on not because it was thriving but because the people in it had no reason left to leave or had already forgotten what a reason looked like. I pulled the truck to the shoulder near the trading post. A man in his 60s was sitting on the steps in a lawn chair, watching me the way people in small towns watch strangers. Not hostile exactly, but measuring. I climbed down and told him I was looking for Diane Reyes. Did he know her? He was quiet for longer than felt comfortable. Then he said, "You family?" "I'm the father of her daughter." He looked at me a second time, differently. "You'd be Marcus's replacement then." I didn't know what that meant and told him so. "Diane had a man here for a while, Marcus. He's gone now. She's out at the Harmon place. The old one, past the arroyo." He paused. "She's not doing too well, mister. I'll tell you that plainly. People out here try to help, but she doesn't make it easy. You got good intentions coming here?" I told him I did. "Then go careful," he said, "and don't let the hour get away from you. That road past the arroyo, you don't want to be on it much past 10. I asked him why. He looked off toward the ridge. "Just a thing people say." I thanked him and started walking. He called after me, "Leave the truck, road won't take it." The arroyo was about a mile out, a dry wash maybe 20 feet across with a plank bridge that looked like it predated the automobile. I crossed it on foot, the boards flexing under me, and followed the rutted track up the other side toward the Harmon place. It was a compound more than a house. A main adobe structure with 2 smaller outbuildings, all of it sitting inside a low fence made of stacked stone and old wire. The yard was lit by a single sodium lamp on a pole, throwing everything in a flat orange color that made the shadows look painted on. There were 2 dogs sleeping near the gate. They raised their heads when I approached but didn't bark, which felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. Dogs in the desert bark. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, louder. A light came on inside. I could see it through the gap under the door. Footsteps, then a voice. A child's voice from the other side of the door. "Who's there?" "A girl." I steadied myself. "My name is Daniel," I said. "I'm looking for Diane Reyes. Is this the right house?" A long pause. "She's not here right now." "Is this Lily?" The pause this time was even longer. When she finally spoke, something in her voice had changed. Flattened out, gone careful. "Why do you know my name?" "Because I'm your father." Silence. I stood there in the orange light with the dogs watching me and the cold coming down off the ridges, and I waited. Then the door opened. She was small for 9. Dark hair pulled back, bare feet, wearing an oversized sweatshirt that had a sun bleached to near invisibility on the front. She looked up at me the way children look at things they're not sure are real, with assessment instead of wonder. "You're supposed to send checks," she said. I almost laughed. "I do." "I know. Mom cashes them." She stepped back from the doorway. "Come in, I guess." The inside of the house was organized but wearing thin. The furniture was old and mismatched, clean enough but tired. There were drawings taped to the walls, a child's drawings, sons and horses, and what looked like a woman standing in a doorway, always in a doorway, in every drawing. The figure was always facing away, looking out. I asked Lily where her mother was. She goes walking, Lily said. She was sitting across from me on a wooden chair, watching me with those measuring eyes. She does that a lot at night. She says she can't sleep inside. Does she go alone? Lily didn't answer that. She picked at a loose thread on her sweatshirt. You look like me, she said instead. I was going to say the same thing. Mom has a picture of you, an old one. She keeps it in the kitchen drawer. She thinks I don't know about it. She paused. I've known about it for a long time. I didn't know what to do with that, so I sat with it. We talked for a while. Awkward at first, then less so. She was smart, cautious, old in a way that children get when they've been left to work things out for themselves. She told me about school, about a horse at the property 2 miles over that she was allowed to brush sometimes. She did not talk about her mother beyond the minimum. At some point, she stood up and went into the kitchen and came back with 2 glasses of water. She set one in front of me with a gravity that made my chest ache. She'll be back soon, Lily said. She always comes back before it gets too late. What happens when it gets too late? The girl looked at her water glass. She says there are things out there after dark that aren't good. She doesn't want to be near them when they're moving. I asked her what she meant by that. I don't know exactly, Lily said. I think she means animals, or she means something else. It's hard to tell with her lately. She looked up at me then, direct and serious in a way that unsettled me. Don't leave before she gets back, she said. It would be better if you didn't. Diane came back about 40 minutes later. I heard the gate creak and the dogs shift, and then the sound of footsteps on packed earth, slow and deliberate. When she came through the door, I understood immediately what the man at the trading post had been trying to tell me. She'd been a striking woman when I knew her, dark and quick, with a laugh that arrived without warning and left the same way. The woman who came through that door carried the architecture of that person somewhere inside her, but it was buried under something heavy. She was thin in a way that suggested she forgot to eat. Her hair was loose and there was dirt on her forearms and knees from wherever she'd been. Her eyes, when they found me, went through several things in quick succession. Shock, anger, something that might have been relief, and then a settling into a kind of resigned exhaustion. Daniel, she said. Diane. She looked at Lily. Go to your room, baby. Lily went without argument, which told me something about the house's usual atmosphere. Diane sat down at the table without taking off her jacket and looked at her hands. I told her I'd been passing through on a run and I'd wanted to check in. I said I was sorry for the years. I meant it. She listened without expression. When I finished, she said, You can't take her. I'm not here to take her. Everyone who comes here eventually wants to take something. She looked toward the window. It was full dark outside now, and the sodium light painted the yard in that flat orange glow. The dogs were awake. I could see them pacing slowly along the fence line. Who was Marcus? I asked. Her jaw tightened. A mistake. He's been gone 18 months. Gone how? Just gone. She looked at me steadily. He drove out one night and didn't come back. I reported it. Sheriff said he probably just left. Men do that, apparently. She said it without inflection. I told her I was sorry. Are you staying tonight? I can't. I've got a delivery window in Durango. You should stay. It wasn't an invitation. It was something else. The road back over the Arroyo gets strange at night. I'm not saying that to keep you here. I'm saying it because it's true. People in this town know it. It's always been that way. I asked her to explain. She was quiet for a moment, then, There's something that uses the wash at night. I've seen it twice. Marcus saw it too before he left. It moves low to the ground and it moves fast and it doesn't move the way animals move. She paused. I'm not crazy. I didn't say you were. Everyone says it with their eyes. She turned to look at the window again. The pacing dogs had stopped. It's quiet now. That usually means it's gone or it's very close. Those are the only 2 options. I should have stayed. I know that now. I gave Diane money. More than the usual monthly amount, everything in my wallet. I told her I'd call, that I'd make more of an effort. I told her Lily was remarkable. She looked at me when I said that, and for a moment the exhaustion shifted, and I could see the woman I'd known a long time ago still in there, fighting. "Be careful on the bridge," she said at the door. I walked back the way I came. The sodium lamp behind me threw my shadow long in front, and past the circle of its light the desert was completely dark. No moon. The stars were extraordinary, which sounds like it should be comforting but wasn't. That much starlight only emphasizes how far you are from everything else. I was halfway to the arroyo when I heard it. It was below me before I saw it. In the wash, moving east to west, fast and low. My first thought was coyote, but the movement was wrong. Coyotes move in a certain flowing way, all the weight centered and rolling. This was something else, something that moved in lurches close to the ground like it was built for traveling in the dark, close to earth, unseen. It crossed the wash about 30 yards in front of me and went up the far bank and then stopped. I stopped too. It was sitting, crouching just above the bank, and I couldn't see what it was. I could only see that something was there, a density in the dark that wasn't rock or brush. And it was facing me. I had the absolute bone-level certainty that it was facing me. I didn't move for what felt like a long time. Then it dropped back below the bank and was gone. I crossed the plank bridge at a run, not looking down into the wash, not looking back. I made Durango 2.5 hours past my delivery window. I told my dispatcher I'd had a tire issue south of Farmington and had to change it in the dark. He wasn't happy, but I'd been driving for this company for 7 years without a serious incident, and he let it go. I've thought about what I saw in that wash many times since then. I grew up in desert country. I know what lives there. Coyotes, jabalinas, ring-tailed cats, the occasional black bear coming down from the high country. I know how they move. What I saw that night did not move like any of those things. I've also thought about Marcus, who drove out one night and didn't come back. I didn't find a clean explanation. I still haven't. What I did find about 3 months later was a phone call from Diane. It was the first time she'd called me voluntarily in years. Her voice was steadier than it had been the night I was there. She said Lily had asked about me. She said maybe we could try. Slowly, carefully, to figure out some kind of arrangement. She said she'd been seeing someone in Gallup, a therapist, and she was working on things. She didn't ask me to come back. She just left the door a few inches open. I send the checks every month. I've added to the amount. I'm going to drive out there again in the spring during daylight this time and take Lily to see that horse she likes. I'm going to sit across the table from a woman I failed and try to be useful to her instead. The wash will still be there. Whatever uses it at night will still be there. I'll cross it in the morning when the sun is high and the shadows go straight down. And whatever moves in the dark will be somewhere far below, sleeping or waiting, and none of it will touch what I'm going there to do. That's what I keep telling myself anyway. I'll let you know how it goes. Long haul, Bakersfield, California. The night run on Route 9. I had a load of industrial machinery to haul from a distribution center outside Memphis down to a manufacturing plant in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The cargo was heavy. Hydraulic press components mostly. And the weight of it settled into every turn and every break on the road like the truck itself was reluctant to move. That was fine by me. I'd been running Route 9 and its southern tributaries for 11 years, and I knew the roads well enough to feel their moods. That particular stretch of highway, once you get south of Natchez and cross into the Louisiana lowlands, changes character in a way that's hard to explain to people who haven't driven it. The land flattens out completely. The Spanish moss hangs so low in certain spots that it brushes the roof of the cab, and the cypress trees crowd the shoulders like they're trying to reclaim the asphalt. I've always found something beautiful about it in a raw and unforgiving kind of way. It reminds you that civilization is a thin coat of paint over something very old and very indifferent. My name is Calvin Pruitt, and I've been a long-haul trucker since I was 23 years old. I'm not the kind of man who looks for trouble or invents stories. I say this not to convince you of anything in particular, but because what I'm about to describe still sits in my chest like a stone, and I need you to understand that I am as plain and practical a man as you're likely to meet. The trip had started badly. My co-driver, a guy named Dale, who I'd been partnered with for about 3 years, had called in sick that morning, some kind of stomach virus going around the depot. I was on my own. The dispatcher asked if I was comfortable running solo, and I told him I was. The delivery window was tight, and we couldn't afford to hold the load another day. The client was already irritable about a previous delay. I'd also had a rough few weeks personally. My wife, Sandra, was 7 months pregnant with our first child, and I'd barely been home for more than 2 consecutive days over the past month. She never complained. That was Sandra's way, but I could hear the exhaustion in her voice every time we talked on the phone, and it wore on me. I carried that guilt the way you carry a rock in your shoe, constantly aware of it, never quite getting used to it. I left Memphis at 3 in the afternoon, which meant I'd be hitting the lonelier sections of the route somewhere around midnight. That was fine. I'd done it dozens of times. I had a full thermos of black coffee, a bag of salted peanuts, a country music playlist, and about 15 years of road experience. I figured that was more than enough. By 11 at night, the highway had gone almost completely quiet. I hadn't seen another vehicle for about 40 minutes. The sky was overcast and moonless, which is something you don't fully appreciate until you're in a place with no artificial light for miles in any direction. Out there, darkness isn't just the absence of light, it's a presence, it has weight. The headlights carved 2 pale tunnels through it, and everything beyond those tunnels simply ceased to exist. I was tired. Not dangerously so, not yet, but that particular kind of tired where your mind starts to wander, and you catch yourself 3 minutes deep into a thought you can't reconstruct. The coffee helped, but the thermos was getting low. I checked the GPS and saw that there was a small town about 12 miles ahead, a place called Delacroix Crossing. It didn't appear on the older map I kept in the door pocket, but the GPS showed it clearly enough. A cluster of streets just off the highway, the kind of place that probably existed to serve the oil workers and the crawfish fishermen, and not much else. I decided to stop and see if I could find a place to sit for 20 minutes, drink something hot, and give my eyes a rest. Delacroix Crossing was smaller than I expected. The main street had a hardware store that was obviously closed, a post office the size of a garden shed, and a bar and grill called Thibodeau's that had a neon sign in the window. Half of it burnt out, advertising cold beer and hot food. There were a couple of pickup trucks parked out front and a light on inside. I pulled the rig off to the side of the road, set the hazards, and went in. The place smelled like fryer oil and cigarette smoke and river mud. There were maybe 6 or 7 people inside, a couple of men at the bar nursing bottles, a group of 3 playing dominoes in the corner, and a bartender who looked to be about 60, built like a fire hydrant with 4 arms that suggested he'd worked physical labor for most of his life. He gave me the same look I always get in places like that. Not hostile exactly, just a careful assessment. Truckers are generally trusted, but we're still strangers. I ordered a coffee and a bowl of whatever was warm. He brought me a dark roast that was strong enough to peel paint and a bowl of red beans and rice that I'm still thinking about to this day. I sat at the end of the bar and ate in silence, feeling the tension drain out of my shoulders by degrees. That's when she touched my arm. I turned, expecting one of the bar patrons. Instead, I found an old woman seated on the stool next to mine. I hadn't even heard her sit down. She was small and very thin, dressed in dark clothing with a purple shawl around her shoulders, and her face was so deeply lined it looked like a topographic map. One of her eyes was clouded white with cataracts. The other was sharp and dark and completely focused on me. "You've got a woman at home with a child coming?" she said. No greeting, no preamble, just that. I set down my spoon. "I'm sorry?" "Heavy with child, close to the time?" She nodded slightly as if confirming something to herself. I looked at the bartender, but he was down at the other end, polishing glasses and paying us no attention. I looked back at the woman. "How do you know that?" I asked. She smiled. It wasn't an unkind smile, but it wasn't warm either. It was the smile of someone who knows exactly how much to reveal and chooses carefully. "I know a lot of things," she said. "I've been sitting at bars like this one for 40 years, and people carry their lives on their faces whether they know it or not. You carry a woman and a child, and you carry the guilt of being away from them. It's written all over you." I could have left it there, probably should have, but something about her manner was so matter-of-fact that I found myself reaching for my wallet. I don't know why. I left $20 on the bar between us. She looked at the money for a moment, then at me. Then she placed both her hands flat on the bar, palms down, and closed her good eye. She stayed like that for maybe 15 seconds. When she opened her eye again, she looked troubled in a way that she hadn't before. "You shouldn't be on that road tonight," she said quietly. "I've got a delivery window," I told her. "That's not what I mean." She glanced toward the door, then back at me. Her voice dropped. There's something out there between here and the state line, something that doesn't belong to the living world. I can't tell you what it is because I've never seen anything exactly like it. And I've seen things that would turn your hair white. She paused. It's drawn to movement, to headlights, to people alone on the road at night. I'll be honest with you, I'm a practical man. I don't put much stock in fortune-telling or ghost stories. But there was something in the quality of her concern. The absence of theater, the lack of performance, that lodged itself somewhere under my sternum and didn't let go. I thanked her and got up to leave. Wait, she said. She reached into the pocket of her shawl and withdrew something small, which she pressed into my palm. It was a coin. Old, worn smooth, with what might have been a saint's image on one face. I couldn't make it out clearly. Keep it in your left hand while you drive, she said. Don't put it down for any reason and don't open the window if you stop. Whatever you hear, do not open the window. I looked at the coin. It was warm, which surprised me, given that it had been in her pocket. And if something happens, she added, don't go looking for what isn't yours to find. I drove back out onto the highway at midnight. The coffee had cleared my head and I'd managed to rationalize the old woman's words into something manageable. She was a local eccentric, the kind every small town produces, half prophet and half con artist, saying just enough truth to make the rest of it stick. The thing about Sandra and the baby could have been a guess. I was at an age where a lot of men have pregnant wives, and my expression probably did carry something of that particular anxiety. Still, I kept the coin in my left hand. The road was empty and straight for the first hour out of Delacroix Crossing. The cypress trees thinned out, and the land opened up on both sides into marshland, low and silver-black under the overcast sky. There was a smell of standing water and vegetation, alive and slightly rotten the way swamp air always is, that came through the vents no matter how I adjusted them. It was about 20 miles south of the crossing, at roughly 1 in the morning, that I saw the light. It was off to the right side of the road, maybe 300 yards ahead. An orange glow, low and flickering. My first thought was a campfire, though that made no sense in swamp country at that hour. Then I got close enough to see that it was a vehicle, or had been one, an SUV, nose down in the drainage ditch that ran alongside the highway, its engine or its fuel tank burning with that thick rolling orange light that car fires produce. I pulled over and called 911. The dispatcher told me units were about 25 minutes out. I relayed the GPS coordinates, confirmed I was on the highway, and gave a description of the vehicle. Then I climbed down from the cab with my flashlight. The SUV had gone in nose first, which usually means the driver overcorrected. Hit the soft shoulder, panicked, jerked the wheel, and lost it. The front end was crumpled badly. The fire was mainly concentrated at the rear near the fuel tank, and it was burning itself out rather than spreading, which was some small mercy. The windows were fogged with smoke and heat. I could see a figure in the front seat. I moved closer, calling out, keeping one eye on the fire. The driver was a man in his late 30s or early 40s, dark-haired, wearing a button-down shirt. He was slumped against the door, the airbag deflated around him. I shone the light in through the cracked window. He wasn't moving, and the angle of his head told me most of what I needed to know, though I kept calling to him anyway, the way you do, because stopping feels like giving up. Then I swept the light around and saw the passenger door hanging open. Someone had gotten out, or been thrown out. I widened my search, moving the flashlight through the tall grass and into the shallow water of the ditch on the other side. I found her about 20 feet back, a woman in a light summer dress, lying in the grass at the edge of the water. I was almost afraid to check, but I did. She was gone too. There was a wound on her temple that the airbag hadn't prevented, and she'd been out of the vehicle when I arrived, which meant she might have tried to get up and then collapsed or been thrown. I couldn't say. I was standing there trying to remember the protocol, trying to slow my breathing, when I heard it. A child crying. Not crying the way a frightened child cries or an injured child. This was the thin rhythmic crying of a very young baby, an infant, coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond the road. I stood still and listened, trying to locate the direction. It was coming from the tree line, which started about 30 feet from the shoulder of the highway. Low, spreading live oaks, their roots half submerged, their canopies dense enough to block what little ambient light there was from the sky. The sound was intermittent but consistent. A few seconds of crying, then silence, then crying again. I thought about what the woman had said. Don't go looking for what isn't yours to find. But a baby, an infant. I went back to the truck and got the heavy flashlight. The long mag light I keep behind the seat. The kind that works as a club if you need it to. And I went into the trees. The ground was soft and uneven, riddled with root systems and shallow standing water. I moved carefully, sweeping the light ahead of me. The crying continued, always seeming to come from about 30 or 40 feet ahead, always retreating at roughly the same pace I advanced, as if whatever was producing it was moving away from me. I told myself it was the acoustics. Sound in dense canopy does strange things, bounces off trunks and water and bark in ways that distort direction. I'd been in the trees for about 5 minutes when I noticed that the crying had stopped. I stopped too. There was a sound above me, a shifting of weight on a branch. The kind of sound a large animal makes when it repositions itself. I swept the flashlight up and saw nothing but leaves and moss. But there had been something there. I was certain of it. The feeling of being watched was so strong and so physical that I actually took a step back before I'd consciously decided to. Then something dropped from the tree directly to my left. Not a sound, but a concussion, the sense of displaced air. Something large landing in the mud 5 or 6 feet away from me. I spun toward it and drove the flashlight beam at the spot. There was a disturbance in the mud, an impression, fresh, filling slowly with dark water. Like a footprint, but elongated, like nothing I knew. I started to back up toward the road. The crying began again, but it was wrong now. It had the right frequency and rhythm of an infant, but the more I listened, the more it seemed mechanical, repetitive, like a recording looped, like bait. Something large was moving parallel to me in the trees. I could hear it. Not footsteps exactly, but a rhythmic displacement. Too heavy for a deer, too fluid for a person. It was keeping pace with me. When I stopped, it stopped. When I moved, it moved. I kept the flashlight swinging back and forth, trying to catch it, and once, just once, I saw eyes. They were about 8 feet off the ground, which meant whatever they belonged to was either very tall or elevated. They caught the beam for less than a second, pale and widely spaced, and then they were gone. I ran. I don't mean I jogged or moved quickly. I ran the way you run when something deep and old in your nervous system overrides everything else and takes control. I ran in the direction I thought the road was, crashing through brush and vaulting root systems, the flashlight swinging wildly. Something touched my back. One sharp, glancing contact like a hand made of hooks. And I felt my shirt tear and then heat, which I recognized distantly as blood. I didn't stop. The coin. I'd put it in my jacket pocket when I'd climbed down from the truck, and my left hand found it by reflex, closed around it hard. I don't know if that matters. I don't know if anything matters in the explanation of what happened next, which is simply that I broke out of the tree line and onto the shoulder of the highway, almost falling onto the asphalt, and the truck was right there. 20 feet away, hazard lights blinking their slow orange pulse. When I would have sworn I'd gone much farther into the trees than that. I got into the cab and locked the doors. My hands were shaking badly enough that it took 3 attempts to get the key into the ignition. I turned on the interior light and looked at my back in the rearview mirror by twisting around. There were 3 parallel tears in the back of my shirt, and through them I could see 3 shallow cuts, maybe 2 inches long each, already darkening. They stung. They didn't go deep. I didn't think they needed more than cleaning and a bandage. The emergency services arrived 18 minutes later. An ambulance and 2 sheriff's vehicles. They found me sitting in the cab with the doors locked. I climbed down and answered their questions as straightforwardly as I could. I'd come upon the accident, called it in, moved to assist, found both occupants deceased, then heard what sounded like a child in the tree line and investigated briefly before retreating to the vehicle. I didn't mention the eyes or the footprint or the sound like a recording played on a loop. I mentioned the cuts on my back and said I'd caught myself on a branch. One of the deputies, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, went into the trees with 2 colleagues and a K9 unit to look for the child I'd reported. They were in there for 40 minutes. They found nothing. Not a child, not a sound, not any evidence that a child had ever been there. I gave a full statement and was told I could continue my route. I reached Baton Rouge 11 hours late, and my dispatcher, to his credit, didn't push me too hard on the details when I mentioned the accident and the police report. I had the documentation. He marked it as an authorized delay and let it go. 3 days later, still at home recovering and waiting on Sandra to come back from her mother's place, where she'd been staying for the last weeks of her pregnancy, I looked up the accident on the local news. It wasn't hard to find. A two-vehicle collision, though I'd only seen one vehicle, which I'd initially attributed to the other possibly having driven away. But reading the article, I understood that there was only ever one vehicle involved, the SUV. A couple named Marcus and Delia Fontenot, both 41, residents of Metairie. Marcus had been driving, Delia had been the passenger. Both had been pronounced dead at the scene by the paramedics who responded. The article was brief and factual. It mentioned that investigators believed the cause was excessive speed on a curve. What it also mentioned, the part that I have read at least 30 times since, the part I keep returning to with the same cold feeling settling in my gut, was that the Fontenots had no children. They had been married for 16 years. They were traveling together to visit relatives in Texas. They were alone in that car. There was no baby. There has never been any explanation given for the crying I heard that night, nor for what followed it into the trees, nor for what I saw watching me from the branches 8 feet off the ground. I've told the story twice. Once to my brother-in-law, who is an ex-Marine and a skeptical man, who listened in silence and then said nothing for a long time. And once to Sandra, months after our son was born, on a night when I'd woken up at 3 in the morning with the familiar sense of those trees pressing in from all sides. She didn't try to explain it, she just held onto my arm for a while. I still have the coin. I keep it in the left cup of my dashboard console, next to my sunglasses. I've never tried to identify the image on it. Some things, I've come to believe, are better left at the level of what they are rather than what they mean. I still drive Route 9. I still pass through that stretch of lowland highway, past the exit for Delacroix Crossing, past the spot where the drainage ditch curves and the live oaks cluster at the shoulder. I drive through it without stopping. I keep the windows up, and I keep my left hand on the wheel. The wrong address. A story from someone who learned that silence isn't always a virtue. I've been driving long-haul trucks for going on 18 years now. Flatbeds, tankers, refrigerated trailers. I've handled them all. But for the past 6 years, I've worked almost exclusively for a concrete aggregate supplier, hauling raw limestone and crushed gravel between a quarry operation near the state border and 2 processing plants further inland. The longer route clocks in at about 140 miles one way. Depending on the weight of the load and the condition of the mountain roads, I can be sitting in that cab for anywhere between 3 and 5 hours. Just me, the diesel hum, and whatever country station happens to bleed through the static. People think long-haul driving is lonely. I've never seen it that way. Lonely implies you want something you don't have. I simply don't want much. My name is Marcus and I'm 44 years old. I rent a 1-bedroom house at the edge of a small town in the Tennessee foothills. I keep the place clean, I pay my bills on time, and I own a large orange tabby cat named Gus, who greets me at the door every evening like I've been gone for a decade. Most weeknights I eat something simple, watch a little television, and go to bed by 9. On weekends I do my laundry, check my truck's fluid levels, and maybe drive to the hardware store for something I don't strictly need just to get out of the house for an hour. I've had 2 relationships in my life, both brief. One ended because she said I made her feel invisible. The other ended because I was never home. I understood both of them completely and harbored no resentment. My job asks a lot of a person willing to share their life with me, and most people, reasonably, aren't willing. I had made a kind of peace with that fact long before the events I'm about to describe. It started last autumn on a Tuesday night after a double run that left me stiff and bored and oddly restless. I'm not entirely sure what possessed me, but I downloaded one of those dating apps, the kind you hear advertised on podcast commercials. I figured I had nothing to lose. I built the most honest profile I could manage, a photo of me leaning against the truck cab, a brief description that said I was a long-distance driver, introverted, not interested in anyone who needed constant attention, owned a cat, liked old westerns and strong black coffee. I honestly expected nothing. The profile read like a classified ad for a monastery. Within 6 hours, someone had messaged me. Her name on the app was listed as Delia. Her photo showed a woman around my age, maybe 38, 40. with dark hair cut short and sharp, a small collection of tattoos running up her left forearm, and the kind of steady, unamused expression that I found immediately more interesting than a smile would have been. She was attractive in a quiet, angular way that photographs rarely manufacture convincingly. She said my profile was the first honest one she'd encountered in 2 years on the app. She told me she worked in medical records at a regional hospital, that she lived alone by choice, that she found most social gatherings exhausting, and that her idea of a perfect evening involved a book and no obligations. She had 2 cats of her own. We texted really, for nearly 4 months. I'm aware of how that sounds, 4 months of texting without meeting, but I want to be clear about what those months actually were. Slow, careful, genuinely comfortable. We weren't performing for each other. We talked about small things, her frustration with hospital administrators, my preference for certain mountain routes over others, the particular ways our cats behaved in cold weather. We argued once mildly about whether a certain horror film from the 80s held up. She said it didn't. I maintained that it did. We moved on. I brought up a video call twice. Both times she deflected, saying she was awkward on camera, that it made her feel observed in a way she didn't like. I understood that. I'm not particularly comfortable being watched either. I let it go. There was one thing she mentioned that occasionally nagged at me. Her living situation seemed inconsistent across different conversations. Early on she'd mentioned living alone. Later she referred to a spare bedroom as my mother's old room, which implied her mother no longer lived there. But then once, offhandedly, she mentioned that her mother had strong opinions about the way she organized her kitchen. I filed these small contradictions away without examining them too closely. People are imprecise in conversation. I was probably imprecise too. The opportunity to meet came in late October, when my dispatcher called to tell me about a temporary contract with a new client, a gravel processing operation that had just opened a second facility about 260 miles from the quarry. The new plant sat in the eastern part of the state, in a county I'd never worked before. I looked at the map that evening and felt something move in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time. Delia's address was 12 miles from that plant. I told her. She responded within 2 minutes. The fastest she'd ever replied to anything with a single line. I've been waiting for something like this to happen. The drive out was on a Thursday, leaving before dawn. I had the load secured and was on the road by 4:30 in the morning. Delia texted me 3 times before 7 o'clock, which was unusual for her. She was typically sparse with messages in the mornings. Each text was short, still dark here, drive safe. I made coffee already, which is silly because you're hours away. I remember reading that last one at a fuel stop and feeling something close to warmth. I delivered the load by mid-afternoon, handled the paperwork with the plant supervisor, and had the truck repositioned and locked down in their yard by 4. I had roughly 24 hours before I needed to start the return trip. I changed my shirt in the truck cab, ran a comb through my hair, and plugged Delia's address into my GPS. The route took me off the county highway after about 8 miles, onto a 2-lane state road that thinned further into a single-lane gravel track winding up through a dense stand of second-growth pine. The GPS kept recalculating, seemingly unsure of itself the further I got from paved roads. The sky had gone a deep bruised orange by the time I turned onto what appeared to be a private drive, marked only by a rusted mailbox with no numbers on it. The house at the end of the drive was a large, low-slung structure. Once probably a farmhouse with a corrugated metal roof that had been patched in several places with different grades of sheeting. The siding was a weathered grey that might have once been painted white, but the yard itself was striking. Meticulously maintained flower beds ran along the entire front of the house, and 2 large clay planters flanked the front door, filled with late-season chrysanthemums in deep rust and gold. It was a startling contrast, the kind of care someone put into something they loved, surrounded by something they'd stopped caring about. I parked behind an older model pickup and walked to the front door. The woman who answered was perhaps 65, heavy-set, wearing a house dress and rubber-soled sandals. She had grey-streaked hair pulled back severely and looked at me the way people look at a car that's just pulled into their driveway by mistake. Not hostile, but not welcoming either. "I'm here to see Delia," I said. Something passed across her face that I couldn't identify. Then she stepped back and said, "Come in. She's resting. I'll get her." I stepped into a living room that stopped me in place. The walls were crowded with mounted animal heads. Deer, elk, a black bear positioned over the fireplace with its mouth open slightly as though interrupted mid-sentence. A full wolf pelt was stretched on a wooden frame above the window. On the far wall, partially obscured by a floor lamp, was what appeared to be a full-body mount of a coyote in a running posture. The furniture was old and worn, draped in afghans of indeterminate color. The room smelled of wood smoke and something else I couldn't name. Something faintly chemical. I stood near the door. I did not sit down. The woman had disappeared through an interior doorway, and I could hear faintly voices from somewhere deeper in the house. Not the words, just the cadence of them. One voice rising, another low and steady. After several minutes, someone else appeared through the interior door. Not the woman. This was a man. Tall, perhaps 50, with a heavy build running to fat and a beard that reached his collarbone. He was wearing canvas work pants and a thermal undershirt, and he walked into the room without appearing to register my presence at all. He moved directly to a wooden cabinet against the wall, opened it, and removed a rifle. I took one step backward toward the front door. "I was just leaving," I said. My voice sounded remarkably steady, which surprised me. The man turned and looked at me then for the first time. He didn't raise the rifle. He held it at his side like a walking stick and looked past me toward the window. His expression was focused, but not on me. On something outside or something in his own head. "You need to be somewhere?" he asked. "Yes, sir, I do." He nodded slowly, looked at the window once more, and then walked back through the interior door without another word. I tried the front door. It was locked, not a deadbolt. I could see there was no deadbolt, but something had been thrown on the knob from the inside. "Hello?" I called toward the back of the house. My voice came out too thin. I cleared my throat. "Hello, I'm going to head out. If you could just unlock the door." Silence. Then from somewhere a dog started barking. I went through the interior door. The hallway beyond was long and narrow, with a low ceiling and no overhead light. Water stains mapped the walls in dark continents. The floor creaked under every step. I counted 6 closed doors and kept my phone's flashlight aimed at the floor. The second door on the left was ajar. I pushed it open carefully. Empty. Completely empty, except for a small shelf on the far wall holding 3 ceramic urns of graduated sizes, each sealed and labeled in handwriting too small to read from the doorway. I eased the door shut. From one of the other rooms I heard footsteps, and then the woman appeared. Delia's mother, I still assumed. Stepping into the hallway with the flat-footed, deliberate walk of someone navigating in low light. "I need to go," I told her, keeping my voice quiet and even. "I apologize for coming without better notice. Please tell Delia I'll call her later. Can you open the front door for me?" The woman looked at me for a long moment. Her expression shifted in a way I didn't understand. Not confusion exactly, but something slower and stranger than confusion. "Who did you say you were?" she asked. "Marcus, I'm a friend of Delia's. We've been talking for a few months. I drove out from—" "I don't know any Marcus," she said. I breathed carefully. "We met a few hours ago at your front door. You let me in. You said you were going to wake Delia." She shook her head, not in the dramatic, theatrical way of someone lying, in the slow, uncertain way of someone genuinely searching a memory and finding nothing. "I don't have a Delia," she said. I heard myself say, "I'm sorry?" "I don't have any children," she said. "I live here with my nephew." I said nothing. I stood in that narrow hallway with the damp walls and the sealed ceramic urns visible through the door I'd left cracked open, and I said nothing at all. The dog had stopped barking. The house was completely silent. Somewhere in the walls a pipe knocked once and then settled. "Carl," she called. A door at the end of the hall opened. The bearded man filled the frame. He had the rifle across one arm now and was looking at me with an expression that had moved from neutral to something harder. "He says he knows someone named Delia," the woman told him. Carl looked at me for a long time. "There's no Delia here," he said. "I understand," I said. "There's been a misunderstanding. I plugged in the wrong address. I'm sorry to have bothered you." I kept my hands visible and my voice level. "My truck is outside. The white Peterbilt in your drive. I'm a truck driver. I just need to get back to it." Something in Carl's posture changed at the word truck driver. Not much, but enough. His weight shifted, his jaw unclenched slightly. Peterbilt? He said. Yes, sir. He was quiet for another moment, then said, My father drove a Kenworth for 30 years. Hard work, I said. Respectable work. Carl looked at his aunt, or whoever she was, and then looked back at me, and then something passed out of his eyes. He walked past me down the hallway, through the living room, and unlocked the front door. He held it open. Watch the third porch step, he said. It's soft. I drove for 2 hours before I stopped shaking. I pulled into a lit parking lot outside a 24-hour diner, sat with the engine running for 15 minutes, then went inside and ordered coffee I didn't need and drank it standing at the counter because I didn't trust my legs enough to sit. When I got back to the truck, I had 4 texts from Delia. She wrote that she'd waited all afternoon, that she didn't understand why I hadn't come, that she was heartbroken and confused, that she thought we had something real. I sat with those messages for a long time. The light in the parking lot buzzed and flickered. Then I blocked her number, then her profile on the app. Then because I'm thorough, I deleted the app entirely. I've thought about it often since, what the right explanation is. The charitable reading, wrong GPS coordinates, a coincidental address, a pair of genuinely troubled strangers, and Delia. Real somewhere, wondering what happened to me. The less charitable reading. I was never supposed to leave that house the way I left it, and the only thing that saved me was an old man's sentiment about a profession. I don't know which is true. I've decided I don't need to know. What I know is this. Gus was waiting at the door when I got home. I sat on the floor and let him climb into my lap and didn't move for a long time. The house was quiet, the heat ticked in the baseboards. Everything was exactly where I'd left it. I'm a long-haul driver. I've always understood that the most dangerous part of any trip isn't the highway. It's arriving somewhere unfamiliar in the dark, not knowing what you've pulled up to, and having to decide in real time whether to stay or go. I always go home now. That's enough for me. The Grain Road. My name is Harold, and I've spent the better part of my life behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler. I'm from a small town outside Tulsa, Oklahoma. The kind of place that barely makes it onto a state map, where the wind off the plains smells like red dirt and diesel year-round. I turned 62 last spring, and if my knees hold out a couple more years, I plan to retire somewhere quiet, maybe near my sister's place in Missouri, where there's a porch and a dog and nothing particular to do. I was married once, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me. My wife, Carol, was a school teacher who laughed at her own jokes and made the best cornbread in 3 counties. We had 16 good years together before the cancer found her. Pancreatic, the doctors told us in October, and she was gone by February. Just like that, like a candle in a hard wind. She left me with our son, Marcus, who was 9 years old and didn't fully understand what had happened until he did. And then it broke him for a while, and it broke me watching him. Raising Marcus alone wasn't something I planned for. My schedule was brutal. Long hauls to Texas, into Kansas, sometimes up through Nebraska. I didn't have family close enough to help on short notice, so I did what I had to do. Some weeks, I pulled Marcus out of school and took him along. He'd ride in the passenger seat with his headphones on, watching whatever kids watched on tablets in those days, or staring out the window at the flat country scrolling by. He never complained. Even as a small boy, Marcus had an old soul about him. He'd look at a rusted grain elevator or a dry creek bed and ask me things like, "Do you think that meant something to someone once?" He missed a lot of school, repeated the 6th grade. I worried about it constantly, but I tried to fill the gaps myself. History, geography, how engines work, how to read weather, how to talk to people you don't know and earn their trust. Looking back, I think he turned out better for the unorthodox education than he might have in a classroom. By the time he was 18, Marcus was tall and lean, quiet in the way of someone who actually thinks before speaking. He had Carol's eyes, that pale gray-green that looks different depending on the light, and a kind of easy confidence that made people want to be near him. I was proud of him in the way that hollows you out a little because love that deep carries weight. He'd started taking community college courses the previous fall. Computer systems mostly, with some programming on the side. He was good at it. One afternoon last September, he asked if he could ride along on a delivery I was running out toward the eastern part of the state. A routine haul, farm equipment components, headed to a distribution warehouse about 4 hours east on Route 40. I was glad for the company. We didn't talk much at first, which was normal for us. Comfortable silence is a language some fathers and sons learn over years of shared miles. The flat country had given way to rolling hills by the time we hit the 2-hour mark, and the light was that long golden kind that only happens in early autumn. Marcus had his window cracked and his arm hanging out like he used to when he was small. Then he started talking more than usual, laughing at small things, tapping the armrest with a nervous energy I hadn't seen in him before. I let him build toward whatever it was. "There's someone," he finally said. "A girl from my programming class, Nadia. I don't know. She's different." I kept my eyes on the road and nodded. "She lives out this way, actually. She told me she'd be home this weekend and I could stop by." He paused. "Which is why I asked to come along." I glanced over at him. He had the grace to look a little sheepish. "So I'm a taxi service now," I said. He laughed. A real laugh, unguarded. "I'll explain later. You can yell at me on the way back." I told him I wasn't going to yell at him, that I thought it was smart, really, bringing backup transportation to a first visit. He laughed again and went back to looking out the window. My chest felt warm and tight at the same time, the way it does when something good is happening that you know you won't be able to hold on to. We were maybe 30 miles past the midway point when he said, "I think the turnoff's coming up." He directed me onto a county road that I'd passed 100 times without ever turning onto. Gravel over clay lined with scrubby cedars. After about a mile, the road forked and one branch dead-ended at what looked like a natural rock formation, a limestone column, tall and narrow, jutting from the hillside like a raised finger pointing at nothing. "She told me to look for the stone that looks like it's pointing," Marcus said. "Take the left fork, then about 2 miles down there's a cluster of houses. She's in the white one with the green shutters." I pulled the truck to a stop at the fork and left the engine running. The area was completely deserted. Not unusual for rural eastern Oklahoma in the early afternoon, but something about the specific quality of the silence bothered me, the way it pressed in. "I can take you down," I offered. "The road looks wide enough." "No, you'll be late. The warehouse closes at 5. He'd already pulled up his phone to check the time. "It's less than 2 miles. I'll text you when I get there." I told him to keep his phone charged. I told him to text me the moment he arrived. He already had the door open, one boot on the running board, but he paused and looked back at me with a half smile that was entirely Carol's, something fond and a little exasperated, like he understood that I would always worry and was okay with it. He jumped down and gave me the salute. This ridiculous thing we'd started when he was about 7, a sloppy theatrical military salute that had somehow become our goodbye. I saluted back. He walked down the left fork without looking back. I put the truck in gear and finished the haul. The warehouse was short-staffed that day, something about a scheduling conflict, and the unloading took nearly 2.5 hours instead of the usual 45 minutes. By the time I had my paperwork signed and was back on Route 40, it was past 5:30 and the sun was already starting to lean toward the horizon. No texts from Marcus. I'd sent 2 messages at the 2-hour mark. Both showed as delivered. Neither had been read. I called voicemail. I told myself this was nothing. Rural cell coverage in eastern Oklahoma is genuinely terrible. Entire swaths of the county run on one struggling tower. I told myself this and kept driving, but my hands were tighter on the wheel than they needed to be, and I found myself checking my phone at every stoplight, every slow curve. At the Flying J outside Henrietta, I pulled over and got coffee I didn't want and tried to think clearly. There was a man eating alone at a booth by the windows, 60s maybe, with a railroad company jacket and the creased face of someone who'd worked outside his whole life. I don't know why I talked to him. I just did. Told him about Marcus, about the turnoff, about the stone like a pointing finger. He set down his fork. "Which county road?" he asked. I told him. He was quiet for a moment, chewing something over behind his eyes. Then he said, "There's a settlement out that way. Been there, I don't know, maybe 8 or 10 years. People from somewhere else. Nobody's quite sure where. They keep to themselves. Nobody in the county goes out there by choice." He looked at me steadily. "I don't want to scare you, but if that's where your boy went, you should go get him. Tonight." I stood up so fast I knocked my coffee over. He stopped me with a hand on my arm, not hard, just firm. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small wooden cross on a cord. the kind someone makes by hand, lashed with twine. He said his daughter had given it to him years back for road safety, and that I should take it. I told him I'd bring it back. Don't worry about that, he said, just go. I drove back the way I'd come with the cross around my neck and my high beams cutting through a dark that felt denser than usual, thicker like it had weight. The temperature had dropped sharply. By the time I reached the fork at the pointing stone, it was fully dark and the cedars on either side of the left road were just black shapes, and somewhere in them, something was moving. I took the left fork. The road narrowed as I went. Twice branches scraped the passenger side of the cab. Then the cedars thinned and I was at the edge of what might generously be called a village. Maybe a dozen structures, a mix of trailers and rough-built wooden houses, everything dark. No lights in the windows, no vehicles I could see. The road ended at a turnaround that was barely big enough for the truck. I shut the engine off and sat for a moment listening. Then I heard it. Faint from somewhere past the far side of the settlement. A drum. Slow, steady, rhythmic like a second heartbeat. I took the iron bar I keep behind the seat and my mag light and got out. The houses were all shut up, curtains drawn, no sign of anyone. A dog watched me from the shadow of a trailer but didn't bark. I walked toward the drumming, past a house with green shutters. White, she'd said, white with green shutters, and here it was, shuttered and silent. I knocked anyway. Nothing. I knocked again, harder, and heard movement inside, the scrape of a chair, slow footsteps approaching. The footsteps stopped just behind the door and did not open it, and after a minute they retreated again. "Marcus," I called. "Marcus, are you in there?" Nothing. I went around to the side. A single window was propped open an inch. I put my light to it. Inside was a small, dim room, and in a rocking chair near the far wall sat an elderly woman wrapped in a blanket watching me. Her expression was completely flat. I told her I was looking for my son, that he was a young man, 18, had come here this afternoon to see someone. She didn't respond. Her hands moved slowly under the blanket, then emerged holding something long and dark, and I was already moving backward when she raised it. An old over-under shotgun, double barrels, the kind you'd find in an estate sale, and I ran. The drumming was louder now, and with it a firelight oranging the sky above the tree line beyond the settlement's edge. I followed it across an open lot and into a stand of blackjack oaks, and through them to an open hillside clearing. There were perhaps 40 people gathered around a bonfire, a real one, 8 or 10 feet high, fed with whole sections of timber that sent embers spiraling upward. At the center of the fire, a wooden structure was burning, a rough human shape already half consumed. The drum was being played by a heavy-set man at the clearing's edge, his eyes closed, his arms working in a steady, trance-like motion. 3 couples were dancing near the fire. The dance was slow and circular, not celebratory. Something between a sway and a shuffle, as though the music was inside them rather than outside. The 3rd couple was Marcus. He was dancing with a young woman in a long dress sewn from strips of fabric in earth tones, browns and deep reds, and her dark hair was loose around her shoulders. Marcus's face in the firelight was wrong, not frightened, not pained, smiling, but it was the smile of someone in a dream, soft, distant, directionless. His eyes didn't track. He was looking at the girl the way you'd look at something you were certain was real but couldn't prove. There was a man who appeared to be presiding over all of it. He wore a coat of layered materials, heavy and patchworked, and a headdress made of bundled sticks and bird feathers. He carried a book, bound in something dark, the pages thick and cream-colored. He moved between the couples as they danced, reading aloud in a language I couldn't place. Not Spanish, not any native language I'd ever heard. The people nearest to him swayed and wept as he read, some collapsing to their knees with an expression I can only describe as relief. On the opposite side of the fire, 2 men held a dark-colored calf while a woman in a long red garment moved toward it with something in her hand. I didn't watch what happened next. I was watching Marcus. When the presiding man began to move toward the 3rd couple, toward Marcus and the girl, I stepped into the clearing. "That's my son." My voice came out louder than I intended, and the drumming stopped. Every face turned toward me. The fire crackled and popped in the sudden silence. "Marcus," I said, "we're leaving." He looked at me. His expression moved through confusion, then something like recognition breaking through water. He took a small step toward me, then stopped, as though his feet had forgotten how to commit. The presiding man spoke sharply. Whatever he said, it stiffened the people nearest him, and 2 of them moved toward me. Marcus looked at me with an expression I knew exactly. It was the one he'd worn at 9 years old, sitting in the truck outside the hospital while I went in to do something I hadn't wanted him to see. "Help me. Tell me what to do." I walked past the 2 men toward him. I got hold of his arm. "We're going right now," I said quietly. He came. His feet found themselves. We walked fast across the clearing, and then we were in the oaks, and then the open lot, and behind us I could hear voices, running steps, the hiss and pop of the fire. We passed the White House with the green shutters, and I heard the old woman's door open behind us. I didn't look back until I heard the shot. A flat, splitting crack. And something took the cedar branch about 6 inches to my left. I ran. We reached the truck. I had the keys in my hand before we got to the door. Marcus was in and I was turning the key before the door fully shut. 3 men came out of the dark and one of them grabbed the passenger handle, but the lock was down. I threw the truck into reverse. The only option in that turnaround, and started a 3-point turn on a road built for farm equipment, not semis, which was as close to impossible as I cared to get. "Dad," Marcus said, his voice suddenly sharp and clear. I looked up. A man stood at the edge of my headlights with his arm raised, and I could see what was in his hand. I don't know what made me do it, some reflex older than thought. I grabbed the wooden cross from around my neck and held it up in the windshield toward the man, toward the line of people gathering at the tree line behind him. The presiding man, who had followed at a walk, unhurried as though he'd never lost anything he didn't mean to, stopped. He looked at the cross. He looked at it for a full second, maybe 2, and then he said something to the man with the raised arm. The arm went down. I finished my turn and drove. I don't know how fast I went on that gravel road, fast enough that the truck fishtailed twice and I clipped a cedar hard enough to crack the mirror housing. Then we were on the county road, and then on Route 40, and the lights of Henrietta came up ahead, and I started breathing again. Marcus was asleep before we hit the highway, not dozing. Out, deeply unconscious, slumped against the door glass with his chest rising and falling slow and even. I drove with one hand and kept the other on his shoulder until I was sure it was just sleep. He woke up about an hour later with the complete bewilderment of someone who's fallen asleep in one situation and woken into another. Where are we? Oklahoma City almost. He looked around at the highway, the lights, the normal world. How did I get... I'll explain when we stop. He didn't remember the dance. He didn't remember arriving at the settlement or meeting anyone there in the late afternoon. His last clear memory was walking down the fork in the road and then nothing until my voice in the clearing. He didn't know what he'd been given or how. The girl Nadia had stopped responding to every number he'd had for her within a week of that night, and when he tried the one address he had for her, the email bounced back as undeliverable. I filed a report with the county sheriff's office. The deputy who took my statement was polite and thorough and clearly didn't know what to make of it. They sent a car out to the road the following week. The settlement was still there, still occupied, but no laws on the books had technically been broken that they could see, and without Marcus willing to press charges for something neither of us could fully describe or prove, the report went into a file and stayed there. I went back to the Flying J the next time I came through Henrietta, a week or so later. The man with the railroad jacket wasn't there. I described him to the waitstaff. Nobody remembered him. I still have the cross. I don't know who made it or where it came from or why it worked the way it seemed to. I'm not a particularly religious man. Carol was more devout than me, and I always let her carry that part of things for the both of us. But I wear it now on every hole, knotted on the same cord it came to me on. Marcus is doing well. He's finishing his 2nd year of coursework and talking about transferring to a 4-year program in the fall. He still rides with me occasionally. Not often, but sometimes on the quieter routes when the weather is good and neither of us has anywhere particular to be. He sits in the passenger seat like he did when he was small, arm out the window watching the country go by. We don't talk much about that night. There isn't a lot to say that language handles cleanly. But once, a few months after it happened, somewhere on a long straight stretch heading west, he turned to me and said quietly, without preamble, "I didn't know you were coming. I didn't even know I needed you to." I kept my eyes on the road. "I know," I said. The pointing stone is still there, I'm told. People in the county know it. They don't turn left at it. Neither do I.